Hello and welcome to the EXP Required podcast, where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I am Jack, and I'm always joined by Mol. How are you doing, Mol?
I am bloody freezing today, Jack. It's really cold here. The temperatures have dipped, and it's been really, really bloody blowy today. The wind has not stopped. I've been getting tree seeds coming through my windows and on my pillows and everything. It's kind of bonkers.
It's colder than the Snow Queen's tits.
Not the way I would have phrased it, but you know what? Let's go with it.
I now know how Noctis felt on that train. Right.
All comes back to 15.
It always comes back to 15. Anyway, we're not talking about 15 today. We are talking about Final Fantasy V. 1/3 of 15.
Don't start bringing maths into this.
But 3 times as good. We'll have to wait and see. So Final Fantasy V, obviously, is the 5th Final Fantasy game. Released on the Super Famicom in Japan on December the 6th, 1992. The PlayStation in Japan on March the 19th, 1998. North America a year or so later, 1999. And of course, in the EU, because no one likes us, it came out on February the 27th, 2002. Then another major re-release is it came out on the Game Boy Advance in October 2006 in Japan, and then November 2006 in America, and then Europe in March 2007. But of course, because we got a few more months to wait for it, why not? And then, of course, the Pixel Remaster was released a couple of years ago on everything, sort of. So they're the major re-releases of Final Fantasy V, so it's quite an old game now. It's almost as old as me. This game was Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, his last directing in Final Fantasy, at least in the games, because he also directed Final Fantasy The Spirits Within for mixed results. And he didn't return to direct a game until 2011. Do you know what that game is, just for interest's sake?
Ooh, 2011. What came out in 2011?
Not Final Fantasy, it's a different game.
Oh, in that case, probably not then. My expertise ends with Final Fantasy.
No, it doesn't. Well, you know more than you think. It's The Last Story, and I only know because I looked this morning, so I'm not that clever. But I just thought it was interesting how, after being the director for Final Fantasy, he didn't direct anything for a long time. Perhaps he was put off by The Spirits Within and how it was received, even though we like it. So, did you want to talk about your personal memories with Final Fantasy V?
It's very similar to how I spoke about this with the Final Fantasy IV episode, actually. Obviously, it came out on PlayStation in 2002 in Europe as part of Final Fantasy Anthology, which contained the discs for Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy V. I don't remember where I got the box from. It was probably a gift, but that meant that I had access to 4 and 5 at roughly the same time. Now, I know I spoke before about how Final Fantasy IV is one of my all-time favourites and was really quite memorable for me. 5 was similar in that it was a Final Fantasy title, and I was already very deep in the source at that point, but it felt very different to me than Final Fantasy IV. It grabbed me, but it didn't grab me in exactly the same way, and that is because, as I'm sure you're very aware, Final Fantasy V is not a particularly story-heavy game, it's more mechanic-heavy, which kind of lines it up more with 1 and 3. And I've kind of always considered 1, 3, and 5 to be more cousin-like, more sibling-like than a lot of the other games in the franchise, specifically because they do go in a lot harder with the mechanics and the actual story. Now, that isn't to say that Final Fantasy V doesn't have a story. Whether or not it's any good is, we'll talk about that,
we'll get into that, yeah.
But it isn't as in-depth as a lot of later stories in the Final Fantasy series actually became. So it's one of those things that actually, if you stopped me before I did any research and asked me what the plot was, I'd probably scramble to remember, as opposed to, 6 or 7 or 8 or any of the other titles. But if you asked me about the battle system, I would know right away what to talk about. It's that kind of game.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with anything you've said. My experience was very, very similar. So I got this with the Anthology, I think it was 2003. I got the Anthology after playing 8 and 9 and bits of 7. So it was my period where I started going back and navigating through and trying to get the older games which were coming out in Europe at the time. I really remember loving the intro for this game, the opening cutscene with the wyvern and the wind stopping and stuff like that, and that really stuck on my memory a lot. There's also the CG opening. It was on the PS1 version, which was, looking back, it looks uglier than I remember, but I remember it looking amazing at the time. And I also remember, my memory, with a lot of these things, is I don't think I got very far, but actually I do remember pirates and then discovering Faris as a woman, and I remember parts of characters running around. I think it was in the Wind Shrine or something like that, and I definitely remember that sticking in my head because I remember imagining that in Final Fantasy IX, as if what that would look like because of the graphics, and thinking that, wow, all those sprites moving so quickly, how would that work on the PlayStation kind of thing? That probably wasn't thinking about it that deeply, but I certainly remember thinking, oh, that'd be good to see in 3D. So yeah, I mean, I was similar to you. 4, I remember both of them being hard.
Yeah.
But 4, in terms of its characters, more than anything, stuck in my head a little more than 5 did. But I've played it through recently, and I have the same thoughts as you, that I think it was an excellent RPG, really, really well designed from its battle system perspective, like really, really good. And there's an argument, I'm not saying it's my favourite or the best, there's definitely an argument for it being the best in the series, but its story is a little bit thin, I think, as well. So I don't know what thread you want to go down next. Do you want to talk about story first, or do you want to talk about the mechanics first?
Before we talk about either of those, actually, I did very briefly look up the Steam reviews. The Steam reviews for Final Fantasy V. And I was going through specifically the negative ones, because the game is rated as very positive with over 2,000 reviews. But the negative ones are specifically what I usually look at when I'm looking at reviews, because, you'll get your trolley comments, but also, for the most part, if there are bugs or, anything particularly overwhelmingly bad about the game, I'd like to know about that rather than, I really liked the gameplay of this.
Totally.
Now, the version that I was looking at on Steam, most of the negative reviews were actually about the port performance, which unfortunately is quite in standing with a lot of Square Enix products. Their ports to PC are usually not fantastic, and this is no exception. However, the couple that I saw about, I guess, the story specifically really, really made me laugh. One of them was pretty kind of much how I feel about it. This is dated from 2021. Story is a huge reason that you'd play a Final Fantasy game, but this story is as basic and predictable as it gets. It's a pure good versus evil tale with no depth or nuance. Now, I disagree a little bit with the depth. For the most part, it's good versus evil. Your 4 warriors are going to save the world. However, it's this other review that was from 2022. Negative review consisted of one word, and that word is simply, nah. And that made me laugh.
Wow, okay. Someone's not a fan of Final Fantasy V then. I mean, where do we go? Where do we go from here, Mol? Actually, let's go from this perspective. What do you think of this game? Obviously, like, you've talked about your general feelings there. What do you think about it? Do you like this game? Is it towards the top of your list, or is it towards the bottom of your list?
I think it's probably more middling, because I know I've spoke about this before. I really, really treasure a story in a game. I think story and characters are the most vital parts of a piece of art, because, that is essentially what video games are. They are interactive pieces of art. And if the story and the characters aren't up to par for me, then I tend not to be interested. Obviously, 5 isn't as robust as other plots, and its characters aren't as strong as other characters in the series. But I don't think it's a bad game. I actually have quite a fond spot for this, and I don't know if it's just nostalgia. And I think this is something that I've said before, but the battle system is one of my all-time favourites, which I think is probably not an uncommon opinion to have. And the tone of it is a lot more humorous. I don't want to say lighter than other games, because it's not actually light. It does get pretty serious and pretty heavy in some places. But overall, 5 is considered the most humorous of the Final Fantasy games, and it's kind of seen that way for a reason. Sprite work and the overall translation that we were given. All of those things kind of add up for it to be a pretty fun experience, even if it's just from memory alone. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, so my experience of finishing it and rolling credits on this game was recent. By the way, that's really fucking hard, beating the last boss, but we'll get to that. I struggled to relate to the characters in this game the same way as I would in a lot of Final Fantasy games. But at the same time, there were some really good moments. It's definitely a moments game where there's some, like, really, I really like that and what they're trying to get across there. But there's no, like, I really felt like I related to Squall and Final Fantasy VIII as a kid. There's literally, almost no moments like that, really, that I can think of the moments themselves, but I don't think they really resonated quite the same way.
No, not
this
at all.
felt like it's a very contained world. It felt like I was, like, looking in at a different world. It didn't feel like I'd been taken into the world. It was like they were doing a performance for me, which is quite interesting considering that some of the later Final Fantasy games, later at the time, Final Fantasy VI obviously was very much like a play in its respects. Final Fantasy IX was very similar, where they were clearly being a bit of a meta play, where they were referencing and parodying themselves in a sense. I think this feels more like that. It feels very throwaway. It feels like, that was a story we told you, and at the end we're going to do a bow on the curtain, because none of it really matters.
That's a really good way of discussing that. You saying that kind of made me think that 6 and 9 and 12 Tactics as well, they all kind of had the feel of like they are a play that is being shown to you, whereas 5 feels a bit more like the play where everything goes wrong.
Yeah, totally. Well, those ones you just mentioned there are ones like a sort of pantomime where you actually you get involved with it and you can see you get popcorn thrown at you, whereas 5 feels like, it's a little bit further away, maybe a movie. I get it's so difficult because I genuinely got to the end and we talked about head versus heart rating before.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel any deep love for the game, but I also got to the end and thought I really appreciated that. I could see the quality of it, and I can see that there was love put into making it, because it was generally a good experience. And there's a few little things in there that are quite interesting as well. I mean, we'll probably get onto the anime stuff in a bit, which I think is probably going to be more your wheelhouse, but Bart's, for example, is a very shonen stereotypical lead character.
Yeah.
And obviously, hopefully, I'm sure everyone's played Final Fantasy V that are listening to this podcast, but essentially there's like a sort of event that happens at the beginning where a meteor hits the world and then all of the characters meet from that event. Now, I think this might be one of the only Final Fantasy games where none of the characters know each other at the beginning. I mean, it turns out some of them technically do later on, but I think they're all thrown together. Obviously, in a lot of sense, you get some characters that, say, for example, in 7, Cloud comes back, he's already known Tifa. Final Fantasy 8, they all grew up together, and even if you take out the fact that was something you learn later in the game, they're still at the same academy together. Some of the early games, they're all kind of, even with 4, when you meet other characters, you've got Rosa, Kane, and Cecil that are together in a core. This game, you've got Bart's and his pet, Boko, and then he meets Lena, and then Galuf, and then Faris.
Yeah.
And then eventually
it's all very
Krill.
contrived.
Is it Krill? Yeah. And then you hear, actually, that these people knew each other, but there's no real relation to that. That's kind of like, oh yeah, we knew each other. Lol. Yeah. It's not quite as deep as the other stuff in that sense, yeah.
It's one of those things that I know I said earlier that 1, 3, and 5 kind of all hold hands about it, but 5 sets itself apart in that where 1 and 3, you are the ordained warriors of light. 5 feels like these are just people who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time.
Yeah.
It could have been anybody that the crystals chose. Didn't have to be them. They just happened to be there.
Yeah, and I think later games kind of expand on that you could be anyone thing a little bit more, but this is the prototype for that. I think it's the first time they really went on that angle. Again, I don't think they did it badly. They made the landing. There's nothing in this offensively bad, this game. I don't think anyway. There's nothing sometimes it was a bit beige, I think, in its approach, but then again, it's one of those things where perhaps that's a retrospective thing, because we didn't get this game, even, I've played it more recently and rolled credits on it more recently than you have, but even if you played it when it came out straight away in 2002 over in the EU, it was still a 10-year-old game.
Yeah.
So a lot of the kind of this doesn't really make the landing in terms of how the story's told. A lot of it could be because there've been so many games since then and that period that you played that had improved upon it. It's a really difficult thing to. Yeah. And I noticed that a little bit in the how it's received by different places as well, because the Japanese love this game.
Yes.
Whereas I think the West sort of think, it's pretty good. It's a relic of its time, which is, it'd be interesting to see if we relate it to it differently if it came out at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. And I know we've said this before about myriad different titles, but I would be very interested to hear what, Japanese players who played it when it first came out would think of it now. I know that Final Fantasy V obviously didn't release in NA until 98, 99.
Late 98, yeah.
And then didn't turn up in Europe for another few years after that at all. But part of that reasoning was because, when I first read this, I had to stop and just shake my head for a bit because it just seemed so stupid. Squaresoft at the time didn't think that the Western audience was ready for the battle system, for the job system. Apparently it was considered to be too difficult. I think at one point they were kind of considering changing the name altogether from Final Fantasy V to Final Fantasy Job Extreme or something like that, because it was so much more in depth than the job system had ever been before. There's a lot more nuance to it than there had ever been in the series before, and they weren't really sure how it was going to be received. Obviously, they kind of knew their target audience in Japan a lot better than they knew in the West, but yeah, they really were not very certain at all as to whether or not it would be well received in the West, and whether or not it was the kind of thing that we'd actually understand and be able to play with as well. So that's kind of the reason why we didn't get it until much later. I could have sworn as well, and when I tried to find the interview that I was pretty sure that I'd read with this before, they'd actually done a huge chunk of the translation for Final Fantasy V when the order came in that no, we're scrapping this and we're moving on to 6 instead, do that instead. So there had already been work behind the scenes actually put into this game. It was just shelved completely, as far as I'm aware, and if I'm wrong on that, I'm more than happy to be corrected.
I think that a lot of that comes from the extension from, I think, the whole easy type discussion on 4, where the Japanese, again, Final Fantasy 4, going back to that a little bit, was an early localization. I mean, obviously before that, a lot of games hadn't been as story driven in general, so it was easy to sort of it was easier to localize them because it was all visual. You know, there wasn't that much text in the games and whatever. You know, whereas in games like this, RPGs that needed lots of text on the screen, they didn't quite know, I think, how to really judge the audience and what the audience could do. And of course, I know that obviously Western RPGs are obviously different than Japanese RPGs, especially at the time. So yeah, they probably didn't quite know how to pitch it, which is really interesting considering the fact that, you know, a lot of these ideas originally came from Western ideas. You know?
Am I allowed to get on my translation spiel horse now, or shall I leave that for a while?
Please go for it.
Okay, so obviously Final Fantasy V has come out as a few different versions. Originally it came out, wasn't originally on the SNES, was it?
Super Famicom and then the SNES.
Right. Originally on the Super Famicom.
Yeah.
And then it was ported to the PlayStation 1. It was also ported to the Game Boy Advance, and then obviously to the Pixel Remaster decades later. But each of those has used a different translation, with the Pixel Remaster, I believe, actually building on the Advance script.
That's correct, yeah.
Because the Advance script was kind of considered to be the best, in quotation marks, overall version that they'd taken. It took a lot less liberties than the PlayStation script, as I understand it. I think the biggest main change that I was able to read about was that they toned down Faris's pirate speak. She's very piratey in the PlayStation version. There is a lot of yar. It's quite funny, actually, but that Faris belongs in my heart. Even if she's not that, you know, yari in other versions, she always will be to me. However, there was another version of the script that was actually produced. Have you heard of it, or do you know who it was by?
Are we talking about the fan translation?
Yes, I am.
Right, okay. So I've got a few notes on the fan translation, and I'll just make a note about that there, because I talked about this in the 3 episode. So this was, as far as I can find it, the first RPG to ever be completely translated by fans.
Correct.
And according to romhacking.net, so this is my side of the coin, it's possibly the most famous fan translation ever.
Yeah.
Produced by RPGE, which was a group of fan translators. As a quote from the translation description is, in contrast to J2E's FF4 translation, which some say took too many script liberties, FF5 script is occasionally criticised for its blandness. There's just no pleasing people, is there? At least Faris doesn't say "ah" constantly.
Now, I've actually played the Final Fantasy IV translation that you mentioned just there. Liberties does not even begin to describe it. It's not a terrible translation, but I seem to remember at one point William Shatner is invoked, at which no point, it does that happen in the original Japanese script. But yeah, I did not realise until very, very recently that the RPGE translation was considered like the first RPG translation in the world, which is really kind of mind-blowing. And the people behind it were teenagers at the time. I think they were only 13, 14, 15, maybe 16 at the oldest. And it was one of those, they'd heard about it and they wanted to play it, so they did it. And that's kind of insane, considering that we really take translations and localizations for granted. And I mean, I know we've spoken about this before, but we don't even have different release times between versions of stuff. If the Japanese get it on one day, there might be a short wait in translation or to see whether or not people actually want it translated, especially for much smaller studios. But for the most part, we, and I say we as the Japanese, the North American and the European world, kind of all get releases at the same time. So to take that for granted and then sit back and go, these were just kids that just wanted to do this in their own time because they didn't have the means to do it any other way, is kind of mind-blowing. And it's still considered so informative, and I think actually was meant to be the gateway for so many ROM hacking groups and fan translators to actually get their act together and start doing stuff. Imagine having that kind of reach on the world. That's insane.
And what's interesting about it as well, because I did a little bit of research on this, I kind of knew a little bit about that when I was first playing this game.
Really?
Or certainly, I say first playing it, probably in the 2000s when I was on forums. The way people spoke about it was that it was this legendary title, 5, probably because of that. Those people on those forums were talking about how important 5 was for them and how impactful it was for them because of that. Not because of the characters and story, but because of its place in greatness and impact upon the West in that sense. I mean, it's interesting. It's definitely, this particular thing is definitely its own topic potentially.
Oh, for sure.
Because I'd love to dig into looking into like why they decided to go for 5. Probably a lot to do with the fact that 4 was so popular in the West, and maybe at that time there was magazines that had screenshots of 5 potentially. You mentioned there about how it was quite far into development, but perhaps they'd done what they'd done in the West with Parasite Eve. Sorry, in Europe, Parasite Eve was, I remember as a kid, shown in lots of magazines, but we never got it. We got Parasite Eve 2, but we never got Parasite Eve 1. But it was teased to us. Potentially it was a similar thing with that in North American games media. I'd love to dig into that, because
there was an article that I read. I think it was something of an interview with one of the original main founders of the RPGE group. I think it's quite old at this point, and if I'm not misremembering, I think it was a case of they had played other Final Fantasy games and they were looking for the missing link. Like you spoke about with Final Fantasy 3 in our previous episode, you know, how you knew it was there. There's definitely another number between 2 and 4, and you wanted to play it and you knew it was out there, but it just hadn't happened. I think it was very, very similar with this group in Final Fantasy 5. It was more of a case of, we know it's out there, but we don't have it and we want to do something about it.
Totally. I mean, I've read an article on, like a looking back article from, funny enough, released an IGN article from May 21st, 2021. And it talks about the history of the game's development. And it's a massive article. There's loads to it, but I've picked up a few points. I think it's Soberdash is a username.
I think we read the same article, yes.
Read the same article, so I think you know where I want to go with this, because it talked about, apparently he described himself as a script kiddie.
Yes.
And really got into the translated SNES game sort of genre, for want of a better description, because he'd played a lot of the library ones, collect the rest, which resonates exactly with what you just said there. And apparently he stumbled upon information for the Final Fantasy II translation. Now, the Final Fantasy II translation was obviously started first. I think we touched upon that in the 3 episode where like people had picked away at some of the stuff, but potentially he was like the next generation of translators in a sense, and then really pushed forward for Final Fantasy V. And I don't want to take credit away from him or give him all the credit, because I don't know exactly who was involved with it, but I do, in that article it talks about how he had a hex editor and printed out copies of the game's fonts. Apparently like created physical flashcards so that's translating the hex code from Japanese and English.
Yeah, I think the most insane part of that entire look back interview was that this kid didn't know any Japanese at all.
Yeah.
At all. And it was a case of he was memorizing the actual hex codes instead of the actual like words and letters and language, which is just, I cannot imagine doing that. That's insane.
It's cool though, isn't it? I mean, it reminds me a little bit of when they were developing GoldenEye, right? A bit of a tangent. Was GoldenEye on N64, so developed by Rare, a British developer. Shout out to Rare, and they developed up. I think it was in Yorkshire they developed it, and I know Grant Kirkhope, who I've spoken to in the past on my channel, plug. He's obviously a musician and a games composer, and notably for Banjo-Kazooie and lots of other titles. He worked on GoldenEye, and of course he talked at length about how he was a guitarist and musician. He had no idea about flipping programming, especially in the early 90s, and he was shown the hex editor and stuff like that. So it resonates a little bit with that of like, he doesn't really know how to program, but mate, this is how you do this, and you actually understand this part of it. Now we want to literally translate that into this other world. So it was a very sort of like mechanical way of doing it. But actually, I think that seems to create some really interesting results, because those Rare games at the time were really, really good and really, really interesting. And there's actually a lot of interesting things to talk about around the development. You know, I think it's cool. Anyway.
No, big time. When I was looking at the different localizations as well, because obviously RPGE were a completely unofficial fan translation, they had nothing to do with the actual official ones whatsoever. I couldn't find who actually translated the PlayStation version. There wasn't a specific name out there. The closest that Google seemed to want to give me was Alexander O. Smith, who was the translator for Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII. He had nothing to do with this, so I don't know why Google gave me that name. And it wasn't Ted Woolsey as much as he wanted it to be. He did originally start work on it. There was an interview that I think I've actually mentioned before in our Final Fantasy III episode, because they are specifically asking about the earlier games. But Ted Woolsey says that one of his biggest regrets was not being able to finish his work on Final Fantasy V, which is why I don't think he was overall the person that they used to work with for the PlayStation version. I can link to that script if anyone's interested. Shoot me a line. It's from playeronepodcast.com, and that interview is from the dulcet years of 2007. But
wow.
The one little quote that I snipped out of that one was Woolsey saying, in North America, FF2, which he thinks was the first RPG for the SNES, did really well because the installed base was really small and the percentage of users that were buying the game was pretty small. But it didn't play out the way that they wanted to. I think the overall goal that Squaresoft had at the time was about $1 million or a copy sold. I can't remember which one it is. And at the time, Enix, this is long before the merger, was kind of really quite heavily competing with them. So he thinks that Nintendo said, you guys are going to be out there as one of the best games. You're going to sell a ton of software, a ton of titles. And they thought that 5 overall was too complicated to be the next big thing that would actually succeed. Now, it wasn't succeeded by Final Fantasy VI. Ted Woolsey goes on to say that was the reason that Mystic Quest came to be a thing.
Oh, yes, of course.
So, yeah, again, it kind of all comes down to perceptions being completely different around the globe. I'm sure there would have been plenty of hardcore gamers back in the day, even in NA and EU, who would have been really interested in Final Fantasy V, but that's not the way that Squaresoft and Nintendo saw it, so we didn't get it. Having said that, I would really, really love to know who the different translators were, because again, we've said earlier, the PlayStation translation is so different to the GBA version, which is the quote-unquote definitive version of the translated text. And, even the RPG-E translation is considered better than the PlayStation version. Stands to reason that the version that I played is the shittest version by far, but that's the one that stuck with me. I'm sorry, everyone. Her name isn't Lena. It is Raina to me, and that's how it's always going to be.
Is it Butts in that version as well?
That's a good question, because you can rename Bartz, can't you? He's the only one that you can rename.
Yeah.
So it could very well have been Butts, it could have been Bats, it could have been Barts. I honestly, genuinely don't recall. I feel like it had been Butts, I would remember, because I would have laughed a lot at that as a kid.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the translations because I got some notes as well. I'm sure you have as well. But before that, a really childish thing to note is there are 2 characters in this game that if you change one letter of their name, it spells farts.
Who's the second one?
Well, Faris. Farts. There you go.
Oh, God. How did I never figure that one out?
I noticed that when I was playing recently. Yeah, there we go. A little bit of childish humour for you. So yeah, on the childish humour side of stuff, because yeah, I mean, it one of those things, it was easy on Final Fantasy 3 episode to be able to go, there were 3 distinct versions of the game, essentially. Yeah. This one, it's like, fucking how many are there? Because of the different, and the translation really adds to that. So like, I noticed this as I was playing through. I figured you would, and I thought, you've obviously influenced me to look into it a little bit more. And of course,
thanks, Jack.
With my sort of relationship to 3 and its early translation, obviously getting that ROM working so many years ago, that put me down the path as well. But also because I was playing the game, the Pixel Remaster, and I noticed some weird quotes that I thought, was that really in the original, or is that just a quirky translation? There's loads of pop culture references in the translation, which I think comes from the GBA version.
So many.
I've made a few notes of them, and this is before I even did any of the research or anything like that. So like, is it Guido or Guido, the turtle?
Yes.
He says to Exdeath, you think I sat around for 7 centuries munching on pizza, which is an obvious allusion to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yep. I spotted that at the time. Like, there's a few other ones as well. I think there's one where like a boy named Lick says, I am so smart, SMRT smart, which is a reference to The Simpsons at the time. There's also like a Team Rocket reference, I think, as well. Gilgamesh, I've invoked his name now, we'll talk about him in a bit. He comes along and turns around and says, prepare for trouble, make it double. And also there's a whip item. The description is best used when problems come along, which is a reference to a song called Whip It by just the band Devo. There's loads of random pop culture references throughout this. How they got away with it, I don't know. And it's hilarious to me, and I think you'll probably agree with me here, that the fan translation's really serious and really good, but the official translation's a joke.
Stupid,
it's weird. It's like, you like a bit of cognitive dissonance there, I guess, where you'd think if it was the other way around, you think that the officially released thing would be really serious and the fan translation would be a bit fun. But no.
Would have loved to be on that translation team.
Oh my God, I mean, like, probably it looks like they just got away with what they wanted. I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, it's probably, again, its own topic to go through and find those actual sort of references to all the different things you've got in the game. Do you know about the other one? I mean, you talked about Legends of Localization in the past, and I decided to be a nerd and look at that website a little bit more.
It's a good website, isn't it?
There is a really weird, and I guess you could call it famous scene, probably famous for nerds like me and you that dig into this shit, in a place called Moor in the Merged World. Do you know which bit I'm talking about?
I don't.
Right. I think it's referred to as the chicken knife scene.
Okay. Oh, there's a scene with the chicken knife. Okay.
Sort of. So in the Merged World, so obviously this game, there's 2 worlds, they merge together at the end, and you can essentially go between, merged locations or whatever. Some exist in both worlds, some exist in one world, that kind of stuff. There's a bit where you go into more and you can go behind some bushes and you can pick between a chicken knife and a brave blade. And I think the chicken knife is that if you run away, it gets stronger. Yeah. The brave blade, the more you use it, it gets stronger. The idea is that they're both polarized different items and you can choose which one you want to choose depending on your playstyle. Now, in various versions, there's the man basically is sat there next to a box saying, "Lol, do you want to buy my chicken knife?" or "Lol, do you want to buy my brave blade?" Strange man living in the forest on his own. And what happens is that in whatever translation it is, he turns into a skeleton and then he clucks like a chicken. Now, the Legends of Localization, I think I'm turning into you now, says that the original text was supposed to be a creepy laugh, as it used hiragana and katakana. Okay. So the quote is from the article. It says, "I feel like what happened is that the PlayStation translator was kind of like, I'm not really sure what the heck this is, but it better do something with it. And since one of the items is a chicken knife, then the chicken sounds make sense." This is also in the Pixel remaster. So the skeleton in the English version clucks at you like a chicken.
Oh my god.
Now, I don't think I'm quite as well versed on you on Japanese language, but I understand that they've clearly done a quirky thing like they did with Fujin in Final Fantasy VIII, where she spoke just with kanji until the end of the game. Yes. Where they've picked the language of the characters and they've gone, let's make this sound, read quirkily. Kind of like we do in English when you've got like the old put capitals in a sentence because it's showing a sarcasm or something like that or whatever.
Yeah. I'm very guilty of doing that.
But it's interesting how, like you said, that the translator went, "Lol, what am I doing?" That's the perception. I just thought that was real. I'm surprised you didn't know about that. I had no idea, and I knew about the brave blade and the chicken knife as well. So the fact that I didn't know that is kicking myself a little bit. Actually, that's really, really cool.
Where's that merchandise?
Yeah, and also because I'm a total nerd, I'm going to mention the README file again, which is the README file that comes along with the translation we've been talking about and bigging up, which is not quite as humorous as the README file for Final Fantasy III, which acted more as a README. It acted as like, this is how the job system works, because nowhere in Final Fantasy III does it explain to you how it works, whereas 5's a little bit better at that. But the README file for the 5 translation, bearing in mind this was written in October the 17th, 1998. Okay. It says, "Squaresoft never released this in English for some reason. A re-release is rumoured for the PC sometime later this year, however," which is an interesting little quirk. Considering the fact that I don't know how the dates are quite lined up here, because it says that it was released in 98, but potentially these guys never heard it was out or whatever. It's interesting how, like, nowadays, as soon as something's known to be coming out, everyone knows about it instantly because of the internet. Yeah. Whereas it seems like they were,
there's a lot more word of mouth back in the day, and have you heard?
Yeah, and so Some2 Freak from the FF3 translation we mentioned before was involved with this project in some ways. Now, this project we've just talked about there, this is the fan translation. Its roots date back to April 1997, which notably is before Final Fantasy VII was released in the West.
Right, okay.
It just goes to show it's not like Final Fantasy VII came along and changed everything and everyone was really interested in looking back at the history of Final Fantasy. This was before that, which I thought something was quite interesting, And it's also, of course, the README still refers to FF2 and FF3 as 4 and 6. And the controls are the same as they are on the SNES games, which is probably means something to someone. I know that the controls are different on the PS1 games, where X means different things, but the games.
If you've ever played any of the PlayStation Final Fantasies back to back, you'll know my pain. The amount of times that I picked up specifically 7 and 8, where circle is cancel in one game and select in the other. Oh my god, you've never been more pissed off than I have.
No, circle is the correct one to be cancel. But I know that I'm talking about. I mentioned Mutski before. Mutski is a Final Fantasy 9, Final Fantasy speedrunner, right? A Twitch streamer. I've known him mainly through his Final Fantasy 9 work, but he does run a lot of other games as well. But they did a I can't remember what event it was at, but it was basically a marathon speedrun of Final Fantasy 8, which I've definitely mentioned on the podcast before. He gets swapped in for a certain point of the game and he turns around and goes, "I'm just changing the controls over so that circles cancel because I'm not a monster." And I really feel that. That's me. That's very close to my heart. So yeah. So any more about the localization and translation you've got?
No, I think that was mostly it. My biggest thing was just that it was a bunch of teenagers doing the very first RPG translation ever, and how big of a deal that is for Final Fantasy V, and yet I've never heard anyone else speak about that. Not that I hear very many people speak about Final Fantasy V in general.
Well, obviously, we're about finding these relics from the past that have been somewhat forgotten. We talked about it in our episode when we talked with Game Dove with May. We talked about FAQs from the past that are written by certain people. I'm big on bigging those people up because they're definitely part of the community, and it's worth exploring those themes a bit more. The more of that you can find, the more of that to talk about, the better to me, because, yeah, it's cool. A few other things, I guess, on the different versions of the game, because I think I've probably got most versions of this game. I have the GBA version. I don't think I played much of it.
Just a quick interjection. Was it the Pixel Remaster version that you played and finished recently?
Yeah, so recently the Pixel Remaster version was the one that I played and finished. I was delighted with it. I think the Pixel Remasters have been brilliant.
You keep saying that. You keep saying that, and you keep making me want more hours in the day that I can get around to playing them.
They are really, really good. I think a lot of the complaints people had, again, probably were with the Steam version because you couldn't change the font and you had to patch it in, whereas the PS5 or 4 version, I should say, actually you can change the font all you want. I think they're brilliant, really. I thought definitely one of the best purchases I've made. But what is interesting is that with a lot of these games, it's really difficult to say what's the definitive version of the game. I think we've talked about this before, where Final Fantasy 3, definitely, where like which one's the definitive version. The original NES version, you could say, oh my god, that would be a nightmare to play now because of, well, one, getting hold of it, and the translation is still as hard, as we've discovered in the last episode we talked about this. The DS version is its own thing completely, and the Pixel Remaster is kind of its own thing incompletely. So which is the best way to interpret and experience the original vision? Now, of course, that's open to the consumer, but with this, for example, with the translation, it opens up a bit of a can of worms with that. What's the best way to play it? The Pixel Remaster is probably the best from a quality of life perspective. One of the things, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about the battle system in a bit more depth, one of the things you can do is you can tweak in the Pixel Remaster how much experience and how much job, what are they called in this? Is it job points in this one? I can't remember, but how much experience you get per level, so you can speed up the grinding and stuff like that. And
oh my god, where was that when I was playing this?
Exactly. So it's a quote unquote better way of playing it because, well, better way for modern audiences anyway. Certainly people like me and yourself have got less time than we did 25 years ago. I got the full experience, I think, but it's definitely interesting that in the GBA version, it uses the Amano images for the faces, which is very similar to, I think the FF2 Famicom version did that as well. I think that was common to the GBA ports of the game, where you'd see the picture on the screen. Yes,
that was definitely an inclusion that then later made its way into, I think it was the iOS and Android ports, which have been since discontinued.
We don't talk about them.
No, we do not. Are they still in the Pixel remasters, or did they get rid of them?
No, they're not. The Pixel remasters are just text. So what's interesting is I don't mind just text. Again, I think this game benefits from those pictures because the characters fall a bit flat in some respects. So I think that's probably a good tangent to talk a little bit about the characters and the story a bit more. So the way this is structured, this story, and I think I mentioned actually Final Fantasy V specifically in the FF3 episode we did, because I'd pretty much beaten both of them by that point. They both tell that sort of, call it an ensemble story. It's more of a story where the gang are all together and they all experience the same world as a core team. 2 kind of does that as well. The first Final Fantasy games kind of all do that. 4's a bit different because the characters split off a little bit. I know in this game they split off sort of, but still the story is told through the group as opposed to the individual, whereas 4, it comes from Cecil's perspective for the majority. Obviously there are little bits that tangent from that, and there are obviously characters that are more important or as important to the story as Cecil is in a sense, but it's his story, or told through his eyes, should we say. This game expands upon, like you say, 3's approach of having a core group together and having the story really be told through the supporting characters. Where this expands on that is that there is more banter between the characters. Now, I think the real reason this game, I guess, fails to stick the landing the same way as some of those other games do with a story is that the supporting characters are really, really naff. Apart from one.
Ooh, let me see if I can guess which one.
Oh, come on. Who's the supporting character that's the best in this game? It doesn't even need stated. No, Faris isn't a supporting character. Faris is one of the main characters. So the five main characters you get, anyone other than those 5 main characters, which are... Shit. Who's the best supporting character? Come on, you should know this. I've already mentioned him. I've already invoked his name. No, Gilgamesh.
No, Gilgamesh. Fuck. Oh, God. Oh, Sham.
What's wrong with you?
Oh, so many things, Jack. How much time have you got?
Other than Gilgamesh, who is objectively one of the best characters in the series, I think that the characters you meet through the story, we talked about this in 3, where actually the story was told through some of those actually quite good characters you meet along the way who you see develop and they come back and save you at the end. That's really cool. I like that. I talked about how that was one of the most resonant things in 3 for me. In 5, there's a little bit of that, but they just, I don't know, just the supporting characters just seem so one-dimensional and boring to me, apart from Gilgamesh.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know if this is even a controversial opinion, but I'm going to go so far as to say that the main cast kind of feels like an extension of that as well. Don't get me wrong, I like the cast. cast. I think that they work, obviously there was work put into making them react to certain ways. They obviously all have their own backstories and I guess strengths and weaknesses as characters as well, but for the most part they all feel very similar, to the point where I know that Lena is a princess and I know that Galuf is definitely not a princess, but sometimes the way that they interact with things just makes me feel like they might as well be interchangeable, which kind of blows. It's a real shame.
Let's go on down the ramp path because one of the big things in this game, well, certainly I remember this from when I was younger, so I definitely played it, and I remember it resonating more at the time, was that Faris and Reyna, or Lena, are long-lost sisters. So what? Like, it doesn't really matter in the story at all. I mean, it matters to them as characters, but I remember, like, quite towards the beginning of the game, they realise they are sisters, and they've got the same father, and then it's just like, wow, we're sisters. Okay. And I mean, of course, that is that the first time the trope's used in Final Fantasy? I think it might be. You got 4 with Cecil and
Golbez, I suppose
Golbez.
So.
They're siblings. So I suppose that is the first time that thing is really touched upon, where they didn't know they were siblings. Of course, I suppose you got 2 as well with Maria and flipping Leon, but like that was kind of like they already knew they were siblings. They just didn't know he was the Dark Knight. So they've gone for the whole, we're more related than we had been in the past, which is a trope Final Fantasy uses a lot more, especially in 8 with the orphanage stuff, which I don't care what anyone says I like, and 9 with Aiko and the fact that she's a summoner and actually she's not related to Dagger, but they are from the same tribe. So there's a bit of that. But the point is that's those stories are woven into the narrative to make more sense and also make relationships with other characters feel different. So for example, with the Final Fantasy VIII and the orphanage stuff, again, you find out that those characters grew up together, apart from Rinoa, who's the outsider, and the fact those characters are together and she wasn't, that changes the dynamic between her and them. In this, it's like, oh, Lena and Faris were separated when they were younger. Well, we just met them anyway, so what does it really matter that these 2 characters we don't know? Why is it significant to the whole narrative of the game that they were
and I think going back to
birth?
something that I said earlier as well, the entire cast feels like it could be changed with absolutely anyone, and that kind of leads into it. Like, okay, it's fantastic that, these 2 long-lost siblings have found each other again, but ultimately it didn't have to be them. They weren't chosen by the crystal, they just happened to be in the right or wrong place at the wrong or right time. It all feels just very, very incidental. And don't get me wrong, now that you've mentioned that it appears in so many titles, it is very much a core Final Fantasy thing, actually. Like, fuck it, long lost siblings, or even just siblings in general, and then their relationships. But for Faris and Lena, it doesn't feel as significant as it should.
I think the problem for me, I mean, there is a little bit later on in the game, and where I think it's before the worlds merge, it's halfway through the game, I think, where Lena and Faris they both dress up in the dresses and stuff like that, and there's the jokes made about, I don't want to wear a dress, and there's a little bit of tension there, but realistically there's not much tension, because the tension is just all of a sudden thrown away. There's no like, they become sisters and we love each other so much, and there's no tension between them after that. They just go, okay, cool. The arc is concluded almost as soon as it's set up. I think is realistically what it is, because all of a sudden because they are part of that core team and they are working together, there's no real separation. There's a part in the story where Elena's not in the party for about 10 minutes because she's doing her royal duties, but it's not for her choice, and it's not because they're torn apart and they've got to go and find each other. The tension between the characters being separated, it just really isn't here in this story. They are separated. I think it's when Galuf and is it Krill or Kryl? Okay,
so this is an interesting one, because technically I think we only really learned how to say it recently, and it was because of Final Fantasy XIV. There is a character called Kryl Baldesian that's actually introduced, and she wears the same little like cat ear devout hood. It's very, very cute, and she's a fantastic character. But until that point, I don't think her name was ever actually spoken aloud. Now, for those who are unaware, the katakana reading of this name is Kururu, which no one knew how to transliterate. I think in some translations she's known as Kara. Obviously, she's now mostly known as Kryl. And Kryl is the way that I say it because this is the way that 14 has popularized it.
Yeah, Kryl.
I do remember reading quite a lot of comments back in the day, specifically of like, is she a shrimp? Like, do we call her Krill? What's going on here?
Yeah, interesting that the characters are separated because of obviously Kryl and Galuf are from the same planet.
Yeah.
But Faris and Lena are from the same planet. so they separate when some jip happens, whatever. I don't really know. It's very difficult to tell because it all sort of like happens at once. It's very confusing. But they do separate, so there is a little bit, but there's no real tension with that. It's just like the next objective, because we're going to get back to a position where we can find Galuf and help him out on his planet, because that's where X-Death has gone. So I think the point is that there's no longing. You don't get that thing where, for example, in Final Fantasy VIII, where you've got Squall's party and Selphie's party separate, and because of the lack of communication in that world specifically, they have no idea what happens to the other ones. And then it's a really emotional, impactful moment when they crawl out of the robot, the BHF, can't remember the acronym, 2. They come out of Fisherman's Horizon, and Squall, like, it's one of the first times in the game you actually see him react to the characters, and because you're from his perspective, you feel that. These characters here that are separate from those characters are worried about them, and that's woven into the narrative. And I think with some of the dialogue that's said, there's a little bit of that where, we're worried we're not going to get back to them, but it's just so, I don't know, I think that the pieces were there, it just didn't really add up to anything with a lot of this stuff, to me.
I feel like the biggest display of, I don't even want to say camaraderie or closeness or anything like that, but the biggest display of it for me is right at the very end in the epilogue, where Kryle's reading her letter and being like, oh, I miss you guys, I hope you guys are doing well. That felt more real to me than a lot of the rest of the game, actually, which is a shame, because the rest of the game should have been about their building up of friendships. And, you kind of get it to certain degrees very, very early on, and then kind of again when Kryle joins up with the party. But for the most part, it just feels like, oh, well, you're part of the group now, let's just mosey. There's no real depth to it, which is a shame, because I'd like there to be. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, I think that point you made there, right at the end of the game, what I thought a bit jarring about that is that Kryle's written a letter to Mid and Sid.
Yeah.
And I don't think Kryle's ever met Mid and Sid at that point.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
It's just assumed that she has, because she's part of that,
It'd be like
gang.
Us writing a letter to Sakaguchi.
Yeah,
you've changed my life, Sakaguchi, and he did, but we've never met him.
And he goes, "Oh, isn't that nice that our friend that we know is a bit weird?" But like, who the fuck's this letter from? What the fuck's that about? But well, if I ever wrote a letter to Hironobu Sakaguchi, I'd have to put in chicken noises in it. So and they'd be like, "That's an in joke." He'd probably get it knowing him. But like, you mentioned there the bit at the end of the game where everyone comes back, because obviously, like, okay, spoiler alert: the big death in this game is Galuf, right?
Yeah,
he sacrifices himself. Now, at the end of the game, when everyone has the happy ending, Kryle is obviously upset that Galuf's dead and goes to I think it's the site of his grave, or is it? It's sort of like a significant site.
The great tree where he died.
The great tree where he died. Yeah, that's right. And then everyone comes and finds her, and isn't that really nice? And that is a really nice scene. But I remember sitting, and then they fly off, so they all go off on their own little pets together and everything like that. And it's a nice, visually spectacular scene. But it's like, when did Kryle become the main character is what I felt like in that moment. Who is the main character in this game? It's a part of it's like, is it Bartz because he's the typical shonen protagonist?
Yeah, I know we talked
Kryle?
About this before with Final Fantasy VI, actually, and the changing of like who's the most important one. And I almost want to make an argument that this kind of tries to do the same thing, or try to do it first. But the problem with that is that Kryle doesn't become the main character at any point. Like, she joins the party, but she's not elevated to that same position that Bartz is. And honestly, I want to say that Bartz is the main character just by virtue of being the person that you're controlling in the very beginning. If it was going to be anyone, I'd say probably Lena should be the main character, but she's not. She's definitely not. She just happens to be adjacent to that position. It's very strange. They all feel like they're orbiting the position of main character without any of them ever actually touching it, which leaves it in a really, really strange position as a Final Fantasy. It's
weird. It's really difficult. There's a few little personality quirks that come out. I couldn't, to be totally honest with you, I couldn't tell you much about Lena's personality in this game.
No.
Very, very little.
She is a princess. That is the end of the list.
She's a princess who wants to find her dad.
Yeah.
And it's a bit disappointing that, considering how well written some of the princesses are later.
Yeah.
Bartz, I mean, I think with Bartz, like some of his humour comes out, especially there's a part where he goes to a library later, right? I don't know if you know about this bit, where there's a few libraries in this fucking game, but there's one where you go to a library and there's a puzzle where you're supposed to move books around to get through to the next part. And one of them, like, you got to like put this in the section T to Z or whatever, and he goes to section A and he goes ASSA, S. Ha ha ha. Opens it up and he goes, hey, this is all about donkeys. So it shows his, and I thought, oh, for God's sake, it shows his personality that he's looking for rude words in the dictionary, and then actually it's not about bums. Yeah. It's about and that's so teenage boy. Like, so actually in a way, like his character does really, really work in that sense. And there's a few moments. There's a moment between Kryl and Bart's later on where Leonard's doing her royal duties and Faris disappears, and they have like a bit of a slapping fight or something like that. And they're poking each other, and it's like kind of like, you know, silly, quirky, like, oh, what you know? Like that, some of that stuff's quite good. And some of the stuff at that point in the game where they fall down a pit and Faris rescues them and goes, oh, sort your lives out, boys, kind of. Yeah. Well, Kryl's not a boy, but like that kind of like sort your life out, guys, kind of thing. You know, it's not gendered. It's like, what do you know, silly people? But you know, like that some of that's there, but then that's so flash in the pan. That only happens a couple of times throughout the story. It's not spread out throughout the narrative the same way as it certainly is in 6 and all the other titles. It's just.
And it's a shame, really, because I actually really quite like the idea of the main character being just some itinerant wanderer. I think that's a really good trope. This isn't something that we've actually discussed yet, but I think the opening to Final Fantasy V is a really, really strong opening.
Oh, no, the opening is one of the best in the series, without a doubt.
That entire opening cutscene without an FMV, there is no FMV. We're not talking about the dodgy PS1 graphics, I refuse. It just doesn't exist. But like that entire opening sequence is really strong, and then to just be shoved into the world, like you're just some dude with his chocobo. That's it. Like that is a fantastic opening. Like it's such a shame, really, that everything that follows doesn't fit.
I've kind of only just thought about this now as you've said it, because I agree. I think I said this at the beginning of the episode here. The opening really stuck with me in Final Fantasy. And if we were to do a best openings list, I think it might be number 1 because of how captivating it is, especially with the soundtrack and this world is fucked. It sets the scene so well. There's a meteor hit. You see everyone's perspective from that meteor, and they all compact on the same place at the same time. It's really, really well written. Now, the problem is, I think it's a victim of its own brilliance because there's no questions. You get all the information you need. These people come from a different place. They're all impacted by an event that impacts them all in different ways, but they're all part of the same world. So that's what ties them together. If you look at the other games' intros, if you look at Final Fantasy VII, I think most Final Fantasy games have good intros. Final Fantasy VII, you first see Aerith or Eris or whatever we called her at the time, and it pans out from her. You go, oh, that's interesting. It pans out to Midgar. Zoe's on the train and we're there with Cloud. So we're already thinking, who's that girl? Yeah. And then we see her again later. So we got a little bit, who's that girl we didn't see there? Final Fantasy VIII, you see the whole kind of like, you know, the time loop thing. You see the intro, like, what the hell's this intro about? Why am I seeing scenes from later in the game? And then you work out at the end of the game, it's all because we've kind of been in this kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy time situation. 9, the intrigue you get there is that you see Dagger at the beginning, and she wakes up she's at sea, and like, you go, oh, what was that about? And then of course you're thrown into the story, so it's at the back of your mind. What was that about? Whereas this game, really, it doesn't really present much of that early on, and like I say, the intro is very straightforward and very, very good and very impactful, but it just throws you into the game straight away and doesn't give you any of that stuff like, who are these people? You know, it's not. That's, I think, it's probably its main weakness is it doesn't deliver tension very well. I don't think the game. I think all the pieces are there. They're just told very 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Having said that, I do like some of the themes the game brings up. And some of the stuff it brings up. I like the generational stuff in this game, where I don't know, I can't remember the name of the team, but the whole idea is that Bart's and Co are the Warriors of Light or whatever, but they've kind of inherited that from...
They're the second generation.
They're the second generation.
Which, so you're right, is a really good
really, really good. And it's handed over to them, you know, from the past. And it's something that I don't... Final Fantasy does that a bit in 8 as well, with the generation passing on the torch kind of thing, and 10 certainly does. Oh, definitely. But here it's kind of like, it was a good little idea where, like, essentially at the end of the game when you go to fight Exdeath was, I don't know the name of the older guys, so the Wolf Man, Bart's his father, Lena and Reyna's father, and does it Galuf as well as the fourth one? I can't remember who the fourth one is. Right, okay, so that you get that, the fact that, you know, Galuf essentially gives his powers to Kryl and she passes the torch in that way. That's cool because they come back at the end and they go, we're going to give you the power to take on and beat Exdeath, who was our enemy. That's done way better than in 3 when my favourite worst villain ever, Zandy, was Doga and Une's villain, the Warriors of Light.
Yeah.
This is like, hang on a minute, you've inherited the villain from us, but like actually you can do better than we can. That theme, it got me quite emotional at the end of the game. I thought that was really cool. I think it's not quite as big a deal as some of the other themes in the other games I talked about. Didn't hit me the same way the opera did in 6 or anything like that. But it was like, no, I really like that. I think they stuck the landing with that quite well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think this is a great place to bring up as well, because I was going to make this comparison anyway. Who do you think is the worst villain? Exdeath or Xande?
Wow.
Because I know your feelings on Xande, and I suspected it would be similar to Exdeath.
I think Xande is worse.
Okay.
And the reason I think Xande is worse is because Exdeath has a banging music theme.
Yes, the fuck he does.
He goes full ham. I'm fucking one-dimensional. He owns it. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not like where Xande like makes out he's this really deep and interesting villain. Look how good I am. He's a complete Burke. Whereas like Exdeath is completely ridiculous. He's a fucking tree. Yeah. And his boss battles are fucking pain in the ass. But whenever he comes on the screen, it's like a Power Rangers villain. It just makes me smile. You know what I mean? It's like that theme starts. You're like, oh, here he is. He's a fucking idiot, but I love him. You know. So I have a bit of a soft spot for Exdeath in terms of how nuanced he is and how well written he is. We talk about this quite a lot. He probably is about as bad. Because what the fuck is his motivation? Like in terms of it, actually, Xande probably has more of a motivation, but he's not interesting enough.
No, I agree with you. He's definitely zesty enough to be fun. He's a lot more interesting visually, thematically, whatever, to look at than Xande could ever be, honestly.
Yeah.
Motivation-wise, honestly, it's so flimsy, but I think I prefer it overall to Xande's as well. And I know I said before in the Final Fantasy 3 episode, but I don't think Xande's reasoning for doing the things that he did is terrible. It's just, like you said, the framing should have been different for it to hit harder. We should have been playing as Ine or Doga. However, when you're... You know, all of the evil spirits in the world have been convalescing in a sentient forest, and now a tree wants the world to end. Like, that's just stupid enough that I can't help but smile about it, you know?
It's hammy enough where it's just ridiculous. I mean, and it's sort of like, it just goes with it as well, because a part of the way through the game, he hides himself in a fucking splinter in your arm or something. It's ha ha ha. And it's like, okay, that actually is an extension of, in some ways, of the bit in 3 where... I can't remember the name of the villain. I think it was a Gigametz or something like that, or whatever villain. No, it might have even been before that. One of the random villains that was nothing to do with Xande hides in you. Oh, I was following you, and that feels very similar here, where he's like, I wasn't gone the whole time. And that's really silly.
I think this also might be part of the reason why I have such a soft spot specifically for the PlayStation version. I say never having played the GBA version or the Pixel remaster, because the entire script is so silly. It works. Everything comes together to just be that flavour of ridiculous. And, like, this is a game where I think I said right at the very beginning as well that, you know, it's not necessarily light. Things do get kind of serious. I think one of the main sticking points is that no matter where you turn up, you always turn up about 5 seconds too late and people die and everything goes wrong because you just weren't quick enough. And actually, I think that's really quite good as far as, like, narratives go, I suppose. But the rest of the world is just so silly. And it's so charmingly silly as well. It's not the kind of thing that makes me roll my eyes and go, oh God, I wish this was over. Can we get back to it? It almost makes me feel like the more silliness there is, the better it is. But at the same time, I feel like there's a really good balance between the serious stuff and the silly stuff. The whole, you know, the world is split in two, and the weapons used to actually defeat Exdeath the first time around and seal, or not Exdeath, Enuo, sorry. When you defeated Enuo and split the world in two and, you know, sealed the void away, these are now in two completely different things. And, you know, there's the sealed library and there's this mystic music playing and it's all very, like, venerable and holy, and it's in over your head. And then Guido the Sage goes, yes, the 12 legendary weapons. They're 12. They're legendary. They are even weapons. Like, it's just so fucking stupid that I can't help but smile. And again, going back to what you said earlier, I think that's why this isn't a bad game in my estimation. It's the head versus heart thing, but my heart just screams for me to like this more than I think it actually deserves.
Yeah, you just reminded me there, tangentially, when me and my friend about 10 years ago now, we played through Link's Awakening on Game Boy. Okay. I've got a Game Boy player plugged into my GameCube. I'm the only person I know that's ever owned one of those fucking things, right? And we played through it at his house, and we played through we played for like 6 hours non-stop. We didn't play the whole game. It took us about 2 or 3 sit-ins. That game is very silly. It's quite quirky in sense as well. There's like loads of stupid things, like there's like talking flipping dogs and talking whales and stuff like that, and there's the windfish, which is actually a massive whale. We were like getting frustrated, not at each other, but we were getting frustrated at the game, going, well, actually, we've got to go to the path over there in the mystical forest, and then there's a massive walrus that we got to give this thing, and we were arguing, and then we just both realised what we were talking about and just fell apart laughing. This has very similar energy to that. Funny enough, I think these games came out around the same sort of time. It's very innocent in a lot of respects, isn't it? It's very silly and not so much parody. It's more like it just embraces its own campiness.
It's too honest to be parody, you're right. And I think, again, because it's building off of the backs specifically of 1 and 3, where it's much more D&D inspired, and if, I don't know if you've ever actually played D&D, but those games can get fucking stupid very, very quickly. It takes itself seriously, but not so serious that you cringe about it.
Actually, funny enough, you mentioned D&D. Actually, I'm gonna mention Ben Starr, because that's my one for the episode. Everyone, when I watched Natural Six, Ben Starr and co doing Natural Six live EGX/MCM earlier in the year. There's a moment where they were sort of making it as I go along. I don't want to sort of cast shade, and they're telling the story. And there's a moment, I think, where one of them turns around and says, "Oh, and then Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls was playing," and they all start. And I think it was completely ad libbed, and they start singing Iris and the Goo Goo Dolls, and you're never going to hear this song the same way again. And then on the Discord later, people were quoting Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls. It's probably now part of their lore. That feels like this game has a lot of that kind of tabletop RPG. Yeah, that's canon now. Like, fuck it. It does feel like it's really interesting, actually, that I've just thought of that now, how it kind of like goes, you're playing along and all of a sudden there's a DM sat there that's omnipotent that's just gone, you know what? Fuck it. He's a tree. And, like you say, that I felt it impossible not to like that and felt charmed by that.
Yeah.
I remember playing through at the beginning, because we'd done our 3 episode at this point, I think, and I was playing through 5, and I got to just before going to the second world and meeting Gilgamesh. And before that, I was thinking, this is a bit flat. I don't know if I'm going to find much to talk about. How wrong was I? And then as soon as Battle of the Big Bridge starts playing and you meet Gilgamesh, I went, I get this game completely. It's just fun.
Yeah.
It's gone, you know what, we'll go all in on the battle system and make that an absolute gem. And we'll just be silly with the story and just have a bit of fun with it. It's almost like it feels like it's, Hironobu Sakaguchi winding down and go, yeah, whatever, put it in, I don't fucking care. It's not, and I don't mean that from a perspective of like him not giving a shit. I think it from a perspective of like, you know what, let's just throw the kitchen sink in because it's my last hurrah, you know? Yeah. And I love it for that, really, as well. It's impossible to hate this game in any respects. There's a few things that are like, come on, but like,
absolute
adds
hate,
to it.
I completely understand.
Yeah.
So I've got one last question for you before we take a little break.
Yeah.
Do you think if Final Fantasy V came out today, do you think it would land the way that it presumably landed back when it released originally?
Oh, that's quite a nuanced question potentially. As a Final Fantasy game, it's difficult. It's hypothetical because if it was released as a mainline Final Fantasy game, tricky.
Because it definitely stands up as its own entry in the Final Fantasy universe.
Definitely.
But I don't think that if it released today without it, already being in the catalogue, I don't think it would hold up. If it was its own non-FF title, maybe, but I still don't think it would be as big of a deal. I feel like Final Fantasy just as a whole has a bit too much of and this isn't even necessarily a negative opinion, but I feel like the overall vibe is a bit too serious these days, and 5 doesn't actually fit in with that vibe so well. I feel like if it came out now, people would be up in arms about it.
They're always up in arms anyway. They're up in arms when it's too serious.
What am I on about?
If you ignore the storyline, and funny enough, this probably leads us into our break, and we'll talk a bit more about the mechanics and stuff like that. I think that the battle system would be extremely well received. Because people are crying out for turn-based / ATB stuff. They want it, and the Final Fantasy fan base want that as well. Yeah. So I think that if the game's design was used as a template moving forward, people would fucking love it. As you said there, I think actually the next step for games now, and this is getting a little bit more broad, the graphics are not as big a deal anymore. Performances can be a little bit. People want their 60 frames per second. They want their pretty looking graphics. But like, I don't really notice the jump up in graphics so much anymore.
No, neither do I.
Compared to what I did between like PS1 and PS2, or even earlier than that, even between SNES and PS1, it was a big thing growing up. Oh my god, like how good that looks. Oh my god, how does the Resident Evil remake on GameCube look so good for a game from 2002? That kind of stuff. The original Resident Evil 1 came out in '96, and 6 years later we had a game which just looks incredible, even now. that doesn't really happen so much.
No, and I don't know about you, but I'm very much a stylist over realist person any day of the week. I think anything that it's got its own identity works so much better than just being realistic.
But I think the point is that narrative is going to be the next big thing for games. How we can tell a story. I mean, the stuff that Hideo Kojima's doing with like Death Stranding and stuff like that, the story's being told in a different way. Mm-hmm. So answering your question about 5, I think 5 as it is would not scratch that itch.
Right.
But from an RPG perspective, it certainly would. It proves even more what we need in the Final Fantasy VIII remake, because the narrative stuff you could do with that, I mean, in Insular Square's head would be what we need. What's what we need, Square? It's what we need.
Listen to us, Square Enix. We know what we're talking about.
Anyway, okay, so we'll take a bit of a break then, and we'll be back in a little bit, and we'll talk about the game's mechanics a little bit and crack on from there.
Awesome.
Welcome back to the podcast. So we're going to talk a little bit about the battle system, the game's mechanics, whatever you want to call it, a little bit more. So this is the culmination of the job system. We talked about 1, 3, and 5. 1 technically has a job system. 3 certainly has the first real use of the job system. Yeah. And then 5 kind of advances that somewhat. I know that it comes up again in 10.2 and Tactics to an extent. But I think they kind of perfected it here. I think this is really, really good. Just to explain it a little bit before we get into the discussion, this version of the job system is everyone has their own role. What's great about this one is that you can keep abilities when you become another job. So you can get to level whatever in one job, like black magic, and then you can then use that as your ability and cast any black magic from what spell, whatever other job you have. So you can mix jobs together, basically.
Yes.
Which I think is fucking amazing.
Yeah, it's so much fun, and it leads to really good party balances as well, because it's not like this job is the best. I'm sure there is a best practice for playing the game overall, but you can find something that works for you, and then you can tweak it to your liking.
Yeah.
As long as you can get through the battle, it's viable. And that's what I like so much about it. Like, the moment that I realised that I could technically cast Cure while not being a white mage, like, mind-fucking blown.
It's incredible game design. Literally, it's probably... Again, like I said before, you could argue this is the best, taking the story stuff out of it, it's the best single battle system in the series. I mean, I might even say it is. I think I'd have to think a bit more about that, but there's no...
I am a hardcore Final Fantasy V job truther, and I have been for my entire life, honestly.
There's no denying that the way the game was designed from a perspective of, like you just said there, I think it's not designed like 3 was, where you have to use certain jobs to do certain things. It was pushing you down a path to use certain jobs to do different things. Obviously, the famous Dragoon fight with I think it's Garuda at that point, where you have to pretty much... I think you can get through it with brute forcing it, but the only real way, the only viable way, is to follow a certain path. In this game, there's so many different ways to solve individual puzzles. So, like, there's the battle with Atmos, or Atomos, or whatever it's called. And essentially that KO with Meteor or something, one of your party members, and then suck them in over a period of time. Yeah. And the puzzle for Atmos is that you're supposed to use that time to damage Atmos, but of course he's resistant to certain abilities. So there's multiple ways you can do it. In that dungeon, 3 floors down, there's a few beasts in chests, and you can use I think it's your Beastmaster ability to absorb them, take them, and then throw them at him. That's one way to do it. So there's like 4 or 5 different solutions to the boss battles. Which I really appreciate
as well. Like, not everyone's going to have the same experience.
And the fact, like, the depth to it and the design to it and stuff like that, and the fact that it felt very difficult to exploit this game because it was so well designed was I really took my hat off to when I was playing it. I mean, one of the weaknesses with 3 is that you get to the end, effectively the 2 main jobs that you end up using are the ninja and the sage, I think it is, which are pretty much just leveled up from your other ones that you've done before. This one, you've effectively created your own super whatever party members. I know later on you can find the mimic. Is it the mimic?
Mimic, yes. It's the only optional job in the entire game.
And that is cool to have. And I think I used the mimic a little bit, but to me, I ended up just having a party of, I think I had a black mage, I think it was a ninja, and I had Kryl as the throw ability one, that throw Gil at people. And I built my party around, let's get loads of Gil, and then I'll throw Gil at the boss because it takes off a lot of damage at once. And it was really useful for the last boss, which has 4 parts at once. and it's a very good area of effect to things. So I had trouble with the last boss, but it felt like a puzzle that I could work out my own way.
Which is
I could
a really
go
good
away.
way to do a last boss.
A really good way to do it. And what I like about the way this game's designed as well is that you can go online and look for a guide, and the guide doesn't spoil for you how to play the RPG elements. It tells you where to go, and it tells you where some of the items are to buy and stuff like that. But it just goes, you know what, over to you, however you want to do it. I'd recommend you do this, but do it your own way. And I really enjoyed how I felt like I'd become fluent in the game system by the end, and I could come up with my own solution to it, and I loved that. I think it was brilliant.
Considering that Squaresoft were so hesitant to release it in the West because they thought it was so difficult to master and that we wouldn't enjoy it. 2002, how old would I have? I would have been 8, maybe 9 when I played this for the first time. I didn't have any trouble picking it up whatsoever, and I had a lot of fun with it too, which I think is pretty significant actually. And again, like you said, you can pick up guides and you can find out where to go because, again, kind of similar to 1 and 3 and 2, I guess, as well. This is very much a game of if you don't know where you're going, you're going to be flying around to find the next area a lot. I do remember doing that a lot as a kid. But the battle system wasn't something that I ever found too difficult.
No.
I think the biggest problem that I had with the battle system, and I don't know if this is me misremembering it, I don't know if this is just the PlayStation version, but leveling up your jobs requires AP on top of EXP. And as far as I'm aware, you don't know how much AP till the next level of your job, which fucked me off tremendously as a child.
I think that's probably a quirk of the PlayStation version, because in the Pixel Remaster, it lets you know how far you've got to go.
Right, okay. Either that or I just couldn't see it.
Potentially. It's one of those things. It's like a quality of life thing, isn't it? Because that is frustrating. Because you can plan, right, okay, this is how long before. Definitely in the Pixel Remaster, you can see, right, I've got 200 out of 250 or whatever. Okay, and this battle's going to cook me 5 AP. I've got 10 battles before I get that. And the Pixel Remaster also lets you turn up how much ABP you get, so it's like a percentage modifier, so you can do it a lot quicker, because I think they realise it's just a time sink at that point, isn't it? I want to level this job up to the full level so I get the full abilities of that one, but then have the other one.
I know I've said previously that I hate grinding, but thinking about it, all of the games that I played when I was a kid were just really grind heavy. Final Fantasy 4, Final Fantasy 5, and I'm just like, damn, these games ruined my enjoyment of that potential. Well, as much enjoyment as you can get out of grinding something, but
Stockholm syndrome is what you're talking about there, I think. I've got a different relationship with grinding. I think that I could quite like sometimes, but once I've worked out something, I can spend it. I feel like I just switch off to it a little bit. It's kind of like, okay, I know what I'm going to do now. I'll just spend a bit of time battling, and I'll put some music on or something like that. I don't mind that, as long as it's not over. It's nice, I think where we talked before with Final Fantasy 16, where I thought the balance was good because you got on with the main game and then you could just go off and just slash a bunch of enemies up for a bit. That game wasn't too grind heavy. It was side quest heavy, but it felt like the balance was there where I want to be intense and be brought in by the story, but actually I can spend a bit of time going and just wasting time and just doing that kind of thing. And I think that's something that some of these games do. I think the real problem with the Final Fantasy games is that the random encounters really fuck it up, because they force you to grind. Which is another reason why the Pixel Remaster is really good. You can turn that fucker off, because it's something that's a real problem. So I couldn't tell you how bad the random encounters are in this game compared to, say, some of the other ones, because I turned them off for most of the time until I wanted to actually do some leveling and stuff like that. Again, I can't do anything but praise this game, and I can't tell you the details of all of it, because I only did my playthrough a certain way, and I can't big up and say what my favourite jobs are or anything like that, other than ones I played with. I know that I read in a book I've got recently, which is the History of JRPGs, which is one of the best things I've ever purchased. It discusses how there's something, I think it's like a yearly thing. It's like you pick random jobs and then play the game through and see how you get on.
Okay.
Which makes it a challenge run type game.
And a challenge run that's different every time too. I quite like
definitely.
that idea. My only other note about the job system, and this is such a minor thing, and I feel like this is something that I've probably brought up in previous episodes as well, but I really like the fact that all of the job outfits are individualized. Everyone has a different look. Some of them are just so cute. The Beastmaster, was it Kryl, just wearing a little sheep outfit? That is the most adorable thing I've ever seen. But then you get shit like the dancer and Galuf wearing a full flamenco outfit, and Bart's with his open top. It's just ridiculous, and it fits in with the world so much. I can't help but love it. I know at one point there were plans to 3Dify this the same way that 3 and 4 actually got done for the DS. Unfortunately, the DS was actually already nearing the end of its lifetime, so that idea was scrapped. And I really think that this job would have sold extremely well if they'd been able to translate it to the 3DS. I think this would have really worked on that system.
I agree. We talked about in the last episode about New Frame Plus talks about the art of Final Fantasy. And we talked about in Final Fantasy 3 how there was loads more sprites for each job, but each character looked the same.
Yeah.
Whereas this, there was so much work with the 5 playable characters and each of the jobs, each of the 22 jobs they had, either each had their own sprite and their own different personality was conveyed through that. And there was a lot of, shout out to Kazuko Shibuya, who, Women in Games, fantastic artist that worked on this stuff. We like talking about women in games and stuff like that. Came back to do a lot of work on this game to help out with the fact that there was so much sprite work to do on this game, because you've got 22 times 5, lots of sprites, and again, a technical marvel they managed to get it done, because there is literally every single character has their own personality and their own different outfit, which I think is amazing. I mean, Bart's Blue Mage outfit is cool as well. It's like Batman or Robin and Batman. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Blue Mage, because this is the first game that has the Blue Mage. Now, I thought a Blue Mage was like a standard thing, but it's actually really synonymous with Final Fantasy.
Oh, yes.
I thought, you know what? Is there anything else that had the Blue Mage in it? And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole online. Do you know much about the history of the Blue Mage or anything like that, or any of this stuff? Right. I mean, it's not really much history, but it's some stuff that's probably really obvious when you think about it, because I went, oh yeah. TV Tropes has a lot to say about the origins of the Blue Mage. So it actually calls it power copying, aka the Blue Mage. From what I could find on Final Fantasy V, it was the first game to coin the actual term Blue Mage. Like I said, it's a big rabbit hole to go down. So there was obviously other video games that contain that kind of thing that aren't necessarily RPGs. Big ones, Kirby. Kirby can absorb other characters by sucking them in. Mega Man kills all the enemies and takes their powers. It's a big Capcom thing, because Dante in Devil May Cry does the same thing, steals their weapons and things like that. In anime and manga, I've got to talk about Dragon Ball as well. I'm getting all my quotas in this week. And so Goku watches Master Roshi do the Kamehameha. A lot of the villains in that will copy the main character's abilities and use them against them. It's a very shonen trope, that.
Right.
And, villains stealing the techniques. All the allies then learn from their comrades those techniques and do it their own way, which is quite interesting. Big one in popular culture is Rogue and X-Men absorbing abilities, and technically she is a game character because she appears in Marvel vs. Capcom and is overpowered because of that. And even something as crazy, and this is going to be a tangent, I don't want to carry on going down too much. Pro wrestling has other wrestlers using their own moves against them, stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, and to be fair, that is a gaming link as well, because you can go, like someone turns around to The Rock and says, "It doesn't matter what you think, or if you smell other stuff." You know, it's quite an interesting quirk.
Oh, that's incredible! I would never have made that link.
Dwayne The Rock Johnson is a Blue Mage. That's what I was saying. Jackie Chan and the Talismans. Shout out that anime. It wasn't really an anime, it was a cartoon where he has talismans that has different powers from different things, and he uses them and then claims their power. It's a concept which is usually overpowered, but something that has a bit of a drawback. Obviously in FF6, I think Gal's technically a Blue Mage, but can only use those abilities with rage and stuff like that. And the drawback in this game is obviously the drawback for Blue Magic in this sense is you have to go and kill all the enemies to get their ability. So it is if you had all those abilities at the beginning, you would be overpowered. But you're limited in 8 by the fact it's Quistis' limit break. You're limited in 9 by the fact that the Blue Mage of Quina has a really shit attack thing. So the fork sometimes hits, sometimes doesn't. So it sort of is interesting that these characters are balanced out. And in this game, they were balanced from the beginning. It wasn't like we just discussed there of how well balanced the battle system is. It wasn't like, well, let's just go for the Blue Mage because of how good it is. You got that risk reward balanced off quite well from the beginning. You know, there's also another character you could argue is a Blue Mage, and you're going to go, oh my god, of course, when you think about it. In Final Fantasy, who do you think?
Not in 5, I'm guessing.
No, in a later game in the series, that it's not overt that they're a Blue Mage. But you're going to go, oh my god.
Yeah, I am. Tell me.
Final Fantasy 16. Clive goes around absorbing all the Icon's powers. So Clive is technically a Blue Mage.
Yeah.
If you think about it, like, it's an interesting concept. Now, what's interesting about that? The reason I thought of that is I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if they actually made the Blue Mage the main character? And I thought, well, actually, technically they have with that one, because, and it's interesting how that becomes the stories told of like that how that ability affects their. I think it could have been. They could have honed in on that a different way and had it like, the rogue type character of that this limits me. Every time I touch someone, I take their ability kind of thing. Or in Heroes with Peter Petrelli, I think the character is, he ends up taking everyone's powers. It would be an interesting story they could tell with Final Fantasy, I'm sure. But I just thought it's really cool how this is the kind of the big origins of it in an RPG. But yeah, really, really cool. I just wanted to celebrate the Blue Mage. So
yeah, no, big up for the Blue Mage. I reckon if we ever get around to cosplaying, we should cosplay the Blue Mage.
I want to do the Bart's Blue Mage outfit. I think it's one of the coolest fucking thing in the world.
So there's one other interesting thing about the job system, and this is to do with the Beastmaster class, which, as previously mentioned, everyone wears sheep outfits, only surpassed by the Geomancer, in which everyone's comfortably in their jammies. But the Beastmaster, as the name suggests, you collect monsters off of the field and then release them, and they'll do their ability onto the field. Now, this ties in nicely with the Blue Mage, because there are some monsters that you will have to trap with the Beastmaster to gain their abilities, like White Wind and Big Guard. For the most part, it's going to be offensive abilities that you actually use. Do you know which mob actually has the strongest ability when released back upon the field?
I don't.
It is the first mob that you actually find. It's a goblin. Now, the goblins are like level 6, I think. They do like 28 damage per hit or whatever, and I don't think they ever use this attack on you, but if you catch one as a Beastmaster and then you release it upon the field, they will cast Flare.
Of course they will.
Which just leads to the question, why haven't the goblins taken over the world?
It's like some super breeding thing. Some geomancer comes along and goes, I'm going to introduce a new species into the wild. It's like creating super snakes in America, isn't it? Let's import African snakes and put them in with super snakes, and then I'll have a stupid snake that will take over the world. That's what it feels like to me. Yeah, that would be the villain, wouldn't it? I'm the geomancer. You have to stop me from making the goblins my minions.
Take off my silly sleeping hat and my power will be gone.
Absolutely. Yeah, that should have been the main villain. One thing worth mentioning again, we mentioned in the 4 episode, but I think it's always worth reiterating. This is the first game to actually show the ATB bar, because it didn't feature in Final Fantasy IV. The bar was there, but wasn't there visually. So it's this technically the first time that existed in a game. And I think, I'm not sure, I can't remember whether it's in the Final Fantasy Anthology version, it's in that port of Final Fantasy IV, but it might be the first time we saw it in the West, in Europe as well. I don't know. I'd have to look into the Anthology port to see if that's the case.
Ask me 20 years ago and I'll have the answer for you.
Yeah, so that's it for the battle. Again, brilliant. Again, it's something that's used later. Tactics has its own version of the job system, which is more to do with like 2 different sides of a balance between different things, and then 10-2 has its own dress-up game version of the job system.
Yeah, which, as I've said before, I love 10-2's battle system as well. I think it is the second best in the series after 5.
This is good though.
Big fan of this kind of thing.
I think they struggled after this a little bit with really meeting the expectation of how good this battle system was, because obviously the next few games we've got 6, which is magic and magicite and stuff like that, and then you've got 7, which is the materia, which is kind of an extension of that, but then a little bit everyone can do their own thing kind of thing, and then 8, obviously the junction system is a bit polarizing, but I think they kind of hit a home run and then have like experimented afterwards. I mean, again, I love those battle systems we just talked about, but like really, it feels like they've kind of gone, wow, how do we better what we've just done? Oh, we can't really. I know, we'll just do something else that's really out of left field. I think it's probably what they tried to do, you know.
I know that you've mentioned before that there's a lot of clamouring for bringing back the ATB style of battle, but I would be really interested to see specifically this job system where you have a main job and then you have like a single thing that you take from another job that you've leveled up. I'd like to see that in an action game like 16 as well. I think that could actually work really well, but it would probably still be complicated as fuck, so good luck to whoever out there wants to put that together for us.
Final Fantasy 17 starring the evil Beastmaster
who is inexplicably dressed like a sheep.
That would be amazing. I would buy that game.
Day one purchase.
Let's talk a little bit about Gilgamesh, because we've mentioned him, we've teased him. And I think, like I say, I think this is actually the first time we've technically mentioned Gilgamesh in the podcast. I think he's supposedly the most recurring character in Final Fantasy in the series. So. Now, what I like about this, obviously, if you beat the game, Gilgamesh you meet on the big bridge, and he's kind of your enemy to start with, but he's not really your enemy.
He's been hired by Exdeath, hasn't he?
He's been hired by Exdeath, and he's sort of like a bit of a mercenary, and then you kind of like, your sheer will convinces him of the error of his ways kind of thing. And he's a bit of a silly character, and then he turns on Exdeath, and Exdeath banishes him to the void. And then you follow Exdeath into the void to beat him, but Gilgamesh is still there, and then you fight him one last time. And I was really sad when he was banished to the void, because I thought, oh my god, no, Gilgamesh, he's not a bad guy. And you just punished him with eternal punishment, never been able to come home. What's going on? But then you find him, and then I think he stays in the void. And I think it's implied that when he appears in other Final Fantasy games, it's the same guy.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I
fucking love that. I love that so much.
Fantastic, isn't it? I know in Dissidia specifically, when Gilgamesh appears, and I want to say this is the teaser sting from the original Dissidia, not from Duodecim, but like he invokes Bartz's name, and everyone's like, who the fuck? Yeah. Like, which is just wonderful. I really, really like that.
He kind of feels like the Deadpool of the Final Fantasy universe.
He does, doesn't he?
You know, he's sort of omnipotent in the way, and he travels between realities, because I think it is implied that one, I mentioned this in our Final Fantasy IX video, like that there's one character that actually does return, and that's interesting as well, with that thread of Final Fantasy IX of being a kind of homage to the first 5 games that were done by Hironobu Sakaguchi, of like actually they could use that mechanic somewhat of actually bringing these people in, you know, the multiverse type thing in a sense, or that it is all in the same universe. And Gilgamesh is clearly going to be the catalyst for that, because we do love our boy. He's just such a, I don't know, he's just great.
I think is the only way that I
but he's
can
so likable.
Yeah.
He's just like, I mean, like when he turns up in 8 as well, and he goes, oh, Excalibur, he's just so great. I mean, like, it's a shame, because I like having Odin in that game. But in Final Fantasy 8, you've got to get Odin early so you can just get him killed, so you can get Gilgamesh turns up, because he's just so much better. Oh, I love Gilgamesh. He's great.
I think, and I know this is the line that everyone knows about Gilgamesh as well, but that introductory line when you fight him, I think it's just before he's banished as well, like, and now we fight like men, and women who dress like men, but enough expository banter, it's time for Gilgamesh. Like, he doesn't get better than that, actually.
No,
I think that might be my favourite line across Final Fantasies, just for how stupid it is.
It is stupid. It's innocent as well. It's like he's trying to be inclusive, isn't he? Basically,
Yeah.
but he's fallen there. He's basically like failing at every hurdle. Like, oh no, I didn't mean that. Oh no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that.
Final Fantasy's first ally.
Yeah, yeah, so true. Good old Gilgamesh. I mean, yeah, he's we talked about established the story's not deep, but that is the one moment where I thought that's dark. You've banished him to eternal darkness, but then he's just like, oh, he's still there, and he comes back, and actually he helps you guys out at the end, you know, which is really, really cool. I love that. There's a boss battle, isn't there, where you fight him with someone else there, and it's just so silly and so cool, and I just smiled the whole time he was on it, especially with his theme song, which is Battle at the Big Bridge coming on.
Iconic. Which is fantastic in every version that it's ever appeared in.
Such a good piece of music as well. Talk about the music briefly. I think we talked about offline about how I think this game falls flat in its music direction, in a sense that every piece is brilliant, but there's not that many of them that I associate with a specific place.
Yeah.
Battle on the Big Bridge is one of the exceptions. Exdeath's theme, and then the main theme as well, kind of associated with Bart's. But the rest of them, like, there's so much good music here. It's definitely Nobuo's bass period, where he loves his turning his bass up.
Yeah, I think I've said previously, and I don't know if I've said this to you offline at all, but Final Fantasy V kind of feels like the Final Fantasy soundtrack to me.
Yeah.
Like, it's not bland, not by any sense, but you're right in that the direction of it is very, not even confused, but it's not necessarily utilised in the same way that other entries in the series do, which kind of makes it just good as a stepping in point if you just want to listen to the soundtrack.
I agree.
And again, all of the tracks are kind of really good. Like, I love the boss battle music, I love the decisive battle music, I love the regular battle music. The overworld theme is fantastic. Lena's theme is really soft and nice. The pirate hideout, you know, is just kind of cool. All of the tracks are really, really good, and I would feel comfortable recommending it, you know, this is a soundtrack to anyone that just likes old soundtracks.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'd necessarily introduce it as like, this is the best Final Fantasy soundtrack, because, like, no, it just sounds really good. That's my entire reason.
There's other things as well, like there's scenes where the music keeps playing and there's no real the direction of it's a bit weak. Although, for example, where it's done well in Final Fantasy VIII, where you're fighting Griever, and then Griever attacks you, and it changes from the theme called Premonition, and it plays I think it's the Legendary Beast, I think it's called, and it starts playing that, and the idea is the tension's changed, and it's really stepped up a notch. That happens in different scenes in the game as well, like we talked about before in 6, where Locke's theme starts playing when he says bye to Rachel, and then oh my god, there's an emotional twist and change because of the music as it jumps to that. In this game, there's lots of stuff where the same piece of music just keeps playing, and it's not, like I say, so the music direction's not as good, but that doesn't say anything against the quality of the music, because it's absolutely to die for.
I know growing up, and this would have been back on, you know, I don't even want to necessarily say Newgrounds. I want to say this, I probably found this on some site like fucking albinoblacksheep.com. Remember that? Or how old am I?
I do.
But someone once created a Final Fantasy parody song set to the Final Fantasy V Chocobo theme song.
Yes.
And I'm ashamed to admit that I still know all the lyrics to it. Sometimes when the Chocobo theme from 5 comes on my iTunes Shuffle, I'll still sing to it, because I can...
Don't be ashamed.
No.
Don't be ashamed.
I think this is one of those things that I probably should be a little bit about.
I know all the words to it as well. That's the Chocobo Robo voice done by Joe Rediford and animated by Legendary Frog, who follows me on Twitter. So
shout out to him.
Yes, so no, that particular video you're talking about, where every Final Fantasy character's in it, and funny enough, Bart turns up at the end and gets stabbed by a Tombury. That is one of the first moments I remember logging into the internet before I had broadband, like it's taking ages for it to download, and watching it thinking, this was made by another person that wasn't like a real game maker. I thought, that what can I do myself? So I definitely agree with that. It's something to
best use of 56k I've ever heard of.
It's with the flipping the little chocobo dancing on the bottom, and it uses like some of the Windows theme song music as well and stuff like that. I love it. Magical.
So going back really briefly to recurring characters, because I did want to come back to this as well. This isn't the series' first super boss. I think technically it is, but it follows on from Final Fantasy 1 and their untechnical super bosses. Yeah, so Warmech and Tiamat kind of make a reintroduction in Final Fantasy 5 as Omega and Shinryu.
Yes,
now,
they do.
They don't really have too much of a presence in the actual game themselves, but again, like Gilgamesh, they occasionally pop their heads in other titles.
Yeah.
And I think the implication there is that no matter what, Omega and Shinryu are going to be chasing each other through the multiverses to try and kill each other. Like, that's just what they do. I know I do this all the time, but Final Fantasy XIV does this fantastically, brings it into its own original setting, and with that exact scenario in mind, manages to elevate it to a whole new level. I never thought I could feel sorry for a robot, but here I am. I just think it's really interesting that of all of the games that have, like, repeating elements from it, 5 is the one that has seemingly the most. That feels significant in a way that, even though 5 isn't regarded as the best Final Fantasy on any tier list, I can think of precisely one person that I know of who it is their favourite Final Fantasy. There are still all of these little elements which keep making their way back, like the job system being what it is, and, you know, the different outfits for different classes. You have Gilgamesh, you have Omega and Shinryu. Like, there's just so many little nods that later titles do back to this one that I think is really sweet. It might have been largely forgotten by the fandom, but not by the actual devs themselves.
I totally agree. And I mean, I think when we talked about the throwbacks that Final Fantasy IX makes to the first 5 games in the series, this felt the most Final Fantasy IX to me. I mean, we talked about like the characters and stuff like that, but the whole merging world thing, like 9's slightly different because it's 2 different worlds, and this is a world that originally was one that kept them apart, but like there's a different place over there and we don't quite know what's going on, and that felt very, very Final Fantasy IX, and it just, I don't know, the whole feel of the world felt like that to me as well. I mean, it just feels so fantasy. I mean, when you go to the second planet and you're walking around and there's the different color on the texture and you feel like you're in an alien world, it just feels so like, wow, okay, like what's going on? I really want to explore this place, you know? I think where the weakness is the NPCs aren't that good, so you don't get a flavour for the world you're in, and it doesn't feel really lived in, which is probably a lot of the reason why it feels a little bit flat in some respects. But the style and the look, and it's like, well, when you go to the second world and you start off and in the middle there's like a big palace, you're like, wow, this is, I really want to look around. I'd love to just, you know, just when you talked about before, would it resonate with modern audiences? If it was a 3D reimagined world, that world just looking around in like camera mode might be really good as well. You know, it's just I don't know,
it's just got a nice vibe to it.
It's got a good vibes, this game. Yeah, it's definitely, it's inoffensive. Well, mostly inoffensive, and we'll talk about some stuff in a minute, which is probably not really that offensive. Good old Gilgamesh and good old Omega. I've never beaten Omega. I think I beat Shinru.
Well, you've got a leg above me then. Jesus.
I think I can't remember. I definitely remember it taking the challenge a bit more seriously, because I just tried Omega and just killed me in one hit. I thought, I can't be fucked with this. And then I went to Shinru, and I think I attempted it a few more times. Whether or not I beat it or not, I don't know. I think I might have done. I can't remember. Yeah, normally I try and have a go at the super bosses, but these were too fucking hard. The end boss, we talked about it earlier, was a fucking nightmare as well. He kicked my ass a few times. And the annoying thing about that is you have to do the entire ending cutscene again. And actually, I talked before about the ending cutscene's really good because it's the old warriors passing the torch, and it's such an emotionally good moment. But then having to watch it multiple times, it's just ruined. You know, whatever.
That's a shame.
The overwhelming optimism in this game is really cool as well. Like Bart's just not give up. No. That's very Final Fantasy. Of like, you know, I think there's a moment, I can't remember the exact quote, where he says, do you think we're just going to sit here and let you? Like, I love that. We're not going to let you do it. We're the ones that are going to get in your way and stop you. It's brilliant, you know.
So I have a question for you then, Jack. What do you know about what happens after Final Fantasy V finishes?
I turn the game off and never play it again. No, I don't. I don't know anything. You've no idea.
So I think we mentioned on our episode with Game Dove, actually, that there's very little supplementary material for a lot of the earlier works of Final Fantasy, because that just wasn't really a thing back in the day. You know, obviously 7 and the compilation changed that a bit, but adaptations, sequels, lore books, that wasn't really a thing back in the day. Final Fantasy V is an exception to that. Final Fantasy V got an anime, or rather, an original video animation, or an
course.
OVA, which is 4 episodes long, only about 2 hours of your time if you want to sit down and watch it. Have you ever heard of it before?
I am familiar, there is an anime, yeah.
It's called Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals. It was released in 1994, so this is pretty old, actually, as a piece of work. I sat down and watched all 4 episodes, and my honest-to-God thought by the end of it was, this is so bad it's wrapped around to being good again, actually. It's fucking ridiculous. It says that it's supposed to be a sequel to Final Fantasy V. I think it's set 200 or 300 years in the future, and everyone is long dead in the game. Like, you see their ghosts at the very end, and you've never seen Bart's looking that way before, let me fucking tell you. Or, looks weird as fuck. Presumably, if this is like an actual lore canon thing, Bart's went on to have a family afterwards because his descendant is the main character. She's a summoner, I think. She summons a chocobo who isn't the chocobo as you know it. It's more in line with the FF2 Amano chocobo, like it's a pink naked bird blob thing. It's very strange. There's a Queen Lena, who I don't think is the original. No, it can't be the original Queen Lena, because you see Lena's ghost at the... she looks like she belongs in a sci-fi anime, but everything looks like it belongs in a sci-fi anime. Like, the art direction is actually really good. It looks really good. The movement is fantastic. Like, it's not stiffly animated at all, and that's because it's done by Studio Madhouse. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with anime studios at all, but some of the big titles that you probably at the very least heard of, even if you haven't watched, Madhouse over the years have been responsible for the original Trigun. They animated Death Note, they animated Black Lagoon, they did the Satoshi Kon Perfect Blue and Tokyo Godfathers and Paprika. They also did Claymore, Chobits, Cardcaptor Sakura, Vampire Hunter D. The list goes on. Like, Madhouse is a very respectable studio, so it's completely...
You had me at Cardcaptor Sakura there. Yeah,
so it keeps completely in line with, like, you know, their stuff just looks really good. The English dub, which is the version that I watched because this was the version readily available on YouTube, unfortunately couldn't find any of the Japanese dub on YouTube. The English dub is very early 2000s, and it's fucking elevated to another level because of it.
Right.
Like, it's the kind of thing that if you heard this dub being done very seriously in this day and age, you wouldn't be able to take it seriously. But knowing the era that it comes from and knowing the media that it follows on, I kind of really want to just implore you to sit down and at least watch 1 episode of this, because it's just so fucking stupid. It's ridiculous.
Has it got Ghost Stories energy?
Kind of.
I'm assuming you sing Ghost Stories dub, which is the best thing I've ever watched. Okay, that's interesting. It definitely piqued my interest. It's like 2 hours as well. It's worth
2 hours for the entire 4 episodes, and at least one point they have the boss battle theme, but it's done with like 90s synth and electric guitar. It's fucking sick, actually.
Is Gilgamesh in it?
He's not, unfortunately.
Oh, that's just not fair, is it? I mean, that's not the one. Okay, I'm intrigued. I'll definitely give it a watch. I mean, it might be worth... We've kind of some deep lore for people that we've attempted to talk about another Final Fantasy anime in the past. It might be worth us having an episode just talking about both animes, watched all of it, and just been there talking about it. Is there enough content for that for 1 episode? Probably not. But for the whole thing, maybe we'll have to wait and see. There's Legend of the Crystals. That's what you just talked about. There's Unlimited, and then there's also is there one other one as well? I can't remember.
Last Order was a single episode. OVA for
God.
7.
And then there's also Brotherhood as well. We've got enough for an episode. Yeah.
Oh dear, 2 very different ends of the human emotion spectrum.
Oh god, well, I'm sure I've just cursed ourselves, haven't I? You know, but no, I will definitely check it out. It sounds intriguing.
If nothing else, Mid is in it. Mid from the original game of Final Fantasy V, and his haircut is just as stupid in the anime as it was in the original game.
Fucking
stupid fucking bowl cut.
Now we've mentioned Mid. This is Mid's first appearance. I mean, Mid is Sid's grandson.
Yeah.
I know that Mid's Sid's daughter in Final Fantasy 16. I prefer Mid as a woman. Personally, I prefer the Mid in 16 to the Mid in this fucking game. And also, by the way, the Cid in this game is the most beige and boring Cid in all of the Final Fantasy games. I won't go so far as to say he's the worst, because you could argue that Cid in Final Fantasy 8 is the worst because he's a fucking war criminal. But Cid in Final Fantasy 5 is just so boring.
Yeah,
I mean, what's also annoying is that like Cid and Mid feel interchangeable because they're always walking around together. Like, what? I just don't care about this Cid. He's just a dick.
I can tell you one little thing about the anime, which is technically a spoiler, but I don't think you'll mind too much, which may or may not change your mind about Cid. So for people listening who want to go and watch the OVA, turn your ears off now. Cid's brain is removed.
Oh no.
But he's already dead, so it's okay. And I don't mean, they take it. No. You actually see Sid's brain being carried off in this anime. There's no gore whatsoever. It's just a brain, but it's like, what the fuck is
sounds like I've got to fucking watch this. It reminds me as well that when we Final Fantasy Unlimited, I keep talking about it, so eventually we'll have to do it. Sid's amazing in that.
Oh, yeah.
He's like one of the best Sids in the entire series. It's worth talking about because of that. But then Sid in Final Fantasy V is law. It's just. I just want to punch him. I'm sorry. Come on, like he's supposed to be. I think it almost like feels like this sort of like meta self-reference of like Sid's appeared in all these games, and then it's finally got to the end of Hironobu Sakaguchi's race. Like, oh, I've got to write Sid again. I'll just make him like a burnt-out guy that doesn't care anymore, which is what he feels like. Oh, whatever. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for our Final Fantasy V discussion. Again, an open-ended thing. There's certainly threads from this that we could touch upon again at some point. Now we've got our wildcards topic. So if I were to say to you, the Tower of Druaga, do you know what that is?
I haven't got a fucking clue.
Well, that makes me happy in a way because I get to tell you about the Tower of Druaga. Right, so the original Tower of Druaga game is a Japanese exclusive video game published by Namco in 1984, released in arcades. So in the game, the player controls, wait for it, the Armored Knight Gilgamesh, who needs to scale 60 floors to rescue the Maiden Key from Druaga, who's a demon who unoriginally wants to enslave mankind.
Of course.
Probably be described as a very slow Pac-Man with a scrolling screen.
Right.
Which was modified from the game Mappy. So the game is a game Mappy, which you might be familiar with if you know anything about early Nintendo games. If you had a Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance came out with a NES version of the console, which had about 10 classic NES games. Mappy was one of them. Have you ever played Flicky? For Sega.
I haven't played it, but I have heard of it, yeah.
You run along the screen, and the screen scrolls. They adapted, I think, a Pac-Man engine to allow them to have a Pac-Man style maze, but you move around the screen slowly and then fight enemies on the screen. So this is a massive, massive deal in Japan, who likes the hidden items and exploration. So it notably came out before Ys, like 20 of them as well.
Right, okay. Again, that's another one that I have heard of. And
Legend of Zelda. So this is kind of the proto-action RPG.
Okay.
So the designer was Masanobu Endo, notable for a game called Xevious, or Xervious, I can never pronounce it. He was essentially inspired to make this game by a business trip to the US where he bought a copy of Dungeons & Dragons and also utilised Babylonian mythology, which is where the Epic of Gilgamesh part comes in, and the Tower of Babel. Now, the reason there were 60 floors in the tower was that at the time, the Sunshine 60 building in Tokyo was the tallest building in Asia.
And I have been in that.
Cool.
That was probably about 15, 16 years ago now. That elevator goes up so quickly that your ears pop. It's insane.
That's really, really interesting. But that was the tallest, and it's amazing thinking that's the tallest building in Asia. Oh my God, that's like it's a small house now, isn't it, compared to all the buildings in Asia? So the game's also very hard, lots of shortcuts and items you need to complete the game being only acquirable after meeting certain criteria on a floor. So what happens is if you go to floor, I don't know the floors, but if you say, or on one floor, you might need an item. If you go to the next floor, you're fucked. But what's interesting about it is that there are stories about books being alongside the game in arcades with people leaving notes for other players, which I think is amazing.
Well, do this on floor 10.
Yeah, so like a hint. I mean, obviously you get it anecdotally when if you've ever been to an arcade when you're a kid and you're trying to beat a level, people are like, oh, you just do it this way, you do it that way. But this is like pre-internet where people were actually leaving notes. Oh yeah, for this floor you want to do this kind of thing, making it a more communal experience and making it far less about the how do I beat this person's high score and more how do we collectively beat the game, beat the tower, which I think is fascinating, especially for an arcade game, which is something that's far more usual these days with the internet and the fact we can communicate with each other a lot quicker. I just think it's really cool how there's almost like a someone leaving notes for the next experience. It almost feels like that. As if you were actually climbing a tower, you go up a tower and you find a book, someone's told you how to get to the next bit. It's really...
That seems really nice, actually, yeah.
Doesn't it? It made me smile. Now, what I also think is interesting here, I watched a video on this talking about how the crash in the games market in the early 80s wasn't quite the same in Japan. So there was also a big guidebook culture in Japan. And obviously, that crashed in the West because of the video game crash. Eventually, they became cheap books, but in Japan, they kind of stayed going, which is probably why we got lots of guides for RPGs and stuff like that. And I know that Alleyway Jack, one of his videos recently on YouTube, talked about the White Seed ship, finding that on Final Fantasy VIII and things where it's difficult to find that. And one of the arguments put across for the reason that was the case was because potentially the game designers were trying to potentially throw at the market of, oh, well, you'll need to buy a guidebook to work this out. definitely a point to explore and think about. So that was kind of like, there were guidebooks. You could buy guidebooks in the shop about how to be a fucking arcade game, take it down to the arcade, and you can almost imagine these kids sitting there going, oh, actually, my book, or having their little bit of power, like my book tells you how to do that, give me a couple of quid. It's a really interesting thing to imagine having happened. I really love that. And it's nice that culture kind of never really went away, in a sense.
Yeah, I know this is going back quite some time now, but the Silent Hill PT demo, I know that when that came out, there was an internet-wide corroboration, I suppose, between players to try and figure out the puzzle that was in that game. And that was one of those things that, as far as I'm aware, actually took months to puzzle out and put together. And it was one of those things that, like, I don't think a single person would probably ever have figured it out by themselves, but with the collective power of many, many people actually tackling it, they figured out how to trigger the special ending or, like, hear a certain phrase in the game that you wouldn't be able to access any other way, which really just absolutely blew my mind when I learned that there was something like that in a demo, let alone, a full game altogether. Coming together and misleading people with, like, oh, you can definitely revive Aerith, you just need to get the underwater materia and then go here, underneath the fish at this time of day when the moon is bright in the sky, or, actually helping people out. I feel like you can't have video games without that culture going hand in hand with it.
It's also something, without getting overtly political, where essentially, we just said there about, the difference between trying to beat other people and be the top of the tree, or trying to all come together to beat the game. Yeah. You're playing against the game. You're in competition, which is a really important human experience, with the game, not with each other, which I like. And that's something that gaming really, almost uniquely brings to the table in that sense. And I love that kind of little social thing. You find out a lot with speedrunning where people won't go, oh my God, I'm a better speedrunner than you. They create the criteria that they can do. It's that balance between competition and being a bit fairer with it, which I love. And that you can see that culture existed nearly 40 years ago, which I love. I think it's really good to celebrate that. But to go a little bit further as well than that, and moving on from that as well, which I think is brilliant on its own right, this game was brought into the Western zeitgeist and understanding when it was released on various sort of Namco arcade ports were made on the PlayStation in like the early 2000s and stuff like that, maybe late 90s. You can go on, you got like an anthology of all these old games that were ported to the console. And of course, I didn't play it myself, but I have played similar things like that. And I've picked the game up and go, what the fuck is this? A lot of Sonic games are like that, where you go, what on earth is this? And then you read into it and think, oh, well, actually, this came out on a handheld years ago. That's why it's crap, A lot of people look at this and, well, that's not that good a game. What's going on? It's just a flipping game I can't solve because they haven't got all that history involved with it. So they didn't have the same experience because of that history was lost. Yeah. Because it's quite fascinating as well. But again, the success of this game in Japan, because it's a big deal in Japan, led to the Babylonian Castle Saga. So this is the first title in the Babylonian Castle Saga, with the first sequel being The Return of Ishtar in 1986. Is a direct sequel, now literally direct, as the events follow Gilgamesh and Ki as they both travel down the tower and escape. Now, what I love about this is that Ki is put as the damsel in distress in the first game. In the second game, you travel down the tower together and do it together, which I think is amazing. And actually, interestingly, going on the trope, Gilgamesh is a typical warrior and uses a sword. Ki's there with magic. So that it does play into the stereotype, which is interesting to see where the stereotype came from of the female character having the magic and the male character having the sword. But it's really refreshing in a way to me that in 1986, it wasn't the case of like, oh, I'll save the princess and then she'll follow me and be like an escort mission. I'll save the princess and then we'll both escape together, which I think is really, really cool. It's almost like the Matrix, isn't it? The thing about every now and then I get on my high horse about the Matrix, how everyone goes on about, oh my God, the one, Neo is the one. But if you've ever watched the Matrix, no, he's the one, but he couldn't have fucking done that without Trinity. He turns her around to his way of thinking, but then they save the thing together. Yeah. And that's a bit of this. And I think that's a refreshing concept to, hopefully be in more games, We've talked about the representation of women in Final Fantasy a lot. That's something I know we're going to talk about a lot more, which is really good. But it's nice how it points to my point of like this stuff was being done years ago. Yeah. And this is towards the early years of gaming. I mean, the gaming industry itself was only really, you could argue it's existed since the 60s, but it's only really been in industry since the late 70s, early 80s. This was early doors, and they were doing it then. Why can't they do it now as much? You know what I mean? Is my take on it. But on the positive note, it's really good, and it's also the fact that it's a co-op game in the arcades. You had to do it as a co-op game. There was no like, oh, that's cool, second player comes in and you do it together. You have to both play together, One more thing to mention on it, and this just goes to show how it's tied in with everything. there's loads more games in the series, but notably there was an anime adaptation in 2008, which pokes fun a lot of the genre's tropes, and acts as a sequel to all the games. So similar to you just said there with Final Fantasy V, it happens like years later. Yeah. So these characters, Key and Gilgamesh, have been real people in that environment, and the towers come back after years. I've only watched a little bit of it, but it's one of those like hidden gem things where I've looked at a bit of the sub and the dub, and they both look like they have similar vibes, because the whole idea is it's a bit of a parody, but a friendly parody, not like just a complete piss take. It's like it's poking fun at itself, but it's also really cool because they don't just nod to the story, they nod to the culture we just mentioned there, where essentially in the series, one of the characters goes to buy a guidebook to help him through the tower, or help them through the tower. It's quite a short series to look at because it looks quite fun, and a really amazing relic that's probably one of those things in Japan that's a big cultural deal that I'd never had heard about until I read it in the history of JRPGs about 2 weeks ago. So yeah, sorry for waffle there.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you. So mine actually follows in really quite nicely from yours and from our original topic as well. I'm going to be talking about a different kind of game today. I'm going to be talking about visual novel, which isn't really a particularly popular style of video game in the West. I don't know how popular it is in Japan either, but it's definitely where the entire thing originated, I believe. Kind of going back to that whole concept of people need to work together to figure something out, kind of ended up being one of the main components of the fan base surrounding these visual novels. I'm talking about the When They Cry series. For those not in the know, they are independent titles. They aren't necessarily sequels to one another. You have probably heard of Higurashi, which was adapted in several manners. Originally, it was a visual novel. It was translated into an anime in 2006, 2007, and I believe it's considered one of like the classic horror animes of all time. It's been visually updated and ported to the PS2, PS3, PS4, the DS, the Vita, the Switch. There have been, I think, additional animes that came out only like 3 or 4 years ago. There was a live action film. There's a manga that's been published by Square Enix. Like, this thing has been going on for a very long time, and this originally debuted in 2002. That was the very first episode. Now, the next entry into the When They Cry series was Umineko, which kind of follows a similar vibe and was never as popular as Higurashi. I think it has a manga adaptation, which was also published by Square Enix, ported to the PS3, the 4, the Switch. It's on Steam. The anime does not exist. We do not talk about the anime because it was absolute dog shit. And there was a fighting game. So if you ever wanted to like play as your favorite characters from the Umineko series and just beat your friends up, I think the servers are still up and running. Both of these are murder mysteries at their heart, but they deal with deeper things as well. Higurashi specifically deals with the concept of believing your friends over everything, and what do you do when adults don't believe you as a child? Like, how do you get out of the worst situation, especially when that situation only repeats and nothing that you do seems to fix it? Which, considering the guy who wrote this used to work in child protective services, or the equivalent of in the Japanese civil servants role, I suppose. And you can very much tell by the way that he writes his prose that this is an issue very dear to his heart and that he knows a lot about. It gets very, very real at times. And the issue surfaces again in Umineko, where, again, it's a murder mystery, but at its core, it's a story of overcoming familial abuse and trauma and the effects on what that has on a person as they grow up and why these people might behave the way that they have. Ultimately, both of these stories have something of a mystery beyond who's doing the killing, which kind of boils down to needing a group of people to come together and discuss, and they do it in both of these stories as well. In Higurashi, the main group of kids come together to try and figure out why this is happening to them, who else it could be happening to, and through the power of friendship, the world is saved. In Umineko, there is a specific riddle that the characters all come together to try and solve. It's one of those things that, unfortunately, as English speakers, we will never be able to translate, or solve, rather, because the translation is just so specific in the original Japanese, and it was very difficult in the original Japanese as well, as I understand it. Now, the guy behind the Dojin Circle who wrote this, which is known as 07th Expansion. This is a person who goes by the pen name, because we don't know his real name. His pen name is Ryukishi 07. He took that name from Final Fantasy V, believe it or not.
course he did.
Ryukishi is the Japanese for Dragoon, technically Dragon Knight, and 07 is a play on words for Lena, who was his favourite character in Final Fantasy VII. One of the characters in Higurashi is named Rena, and her name is directly taken from Lena. The characters beyond that have absolutely nothing similar together, but yeah, it's an interesting point to know that Higurashi is technically, it's a spin-off of FF5 at its, like, very, very heart. Like, good for you, Ryukishi, we love you for that. Now, one of the other main things about Ryukishi's work is that he's always written some fantastic female characters. Now, I know I didn't speak about this earlier in the episode, but it's still time to get on my high horse, so very sorry, listeners. But there was a interview that was done after he finished the last episode of Umineko, where the interviewer mentions that people were assuming that you were a woman around the time of, I think it would have been the episode 5 of Higurashi, and Ryukishi's response was, in both of these titles, I didn't portray the inner workings of a woman, but the inner workings of a human being. Those characters just happened to be women. There were lots of female viewers who said it was hard for them to relate to some of the characters, and I still have a lot of questions about women, so I learned about the differences in perspective while I was writing my next title. I'm not writing for a specific target audience, but I do have the impression that the number of female readers has increased by the end of writing Umineko, and looking at the number of emails that were actually sent to the site, I think women make up the majority of users, which I think is a really refreshing and positive way of looking at this. Now, Umineko, I believe the last episode was actually released in 2010, so this has been over for nearly 15 years at this point. But to know that there was an author who was so open to, I'm not writing gendered characters, I'm writing a character that happens to have a gender, was such a shock to me as just a consumer of media. And this was one of my all-time pieces of media. It was very formative to me in my teenage years and really well written. It's a bit of a slog. It's very, very fucking long, but it's one of those things that I will highly recommend to the people that the genre interests. All of his female characters are really well written. Some of them are weak, some of them are strong, some of them are bitches, some of them aren't. He really runs the full spectrum of what characterhood can be, which I know I've spoken about this before, but I just want to see more of that across genres in general, and that doesn't necessarily stay at video games. I want that in TV, I want that in film. But yeah, I would highly recommend the When They Cry series to anyone who's into murder mysteries and doesn't mind stories that get real, I suppose.
Nothing wrong with that. That's really interesting. But that's brilliant. I enjoyed that, but both touching on some similar themes somewhat, which is always good. Excellent. So with that, where can we find you online, Mol?
I can be found at Adramalek, primarily on BlueSky, although my page there is a little bit empty at the moment. I've been having a little bit of trouble keeping up with my time lately, so you'll have to forgive me for that. I can also be found on Twitter, but I am rolling back how much use I make of Twitter. And what about yourself, Jack?
Pretty much the same for me. I'm, I think it's JackieBoy34 on BlueSky. I think I'm Jack Mol8 on Twitter for now. I think I'm going to stay on Twitter and just not use it, really, unless it's potentially for messaging people.
Yeah.
But no, BlueSky is certainly the home of EXP Required now as well. So we're on BlueSky at EXP Required, and as always on YouTube at EXP Required as well. But I think we're EXP Podcasts still on there as a handle. But yeah, no, please check us out on there and come and argue about my memes. Brilliant. Thanks very much. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.